that after the celebrated 1986 tax overhaul, the number of big profitable corporations that paid no federal income tax was cut by more than half. CBS News business correspondent Ray Brady reports on the exceptions to reform.
In Washington today, charges that while tax reform has helped even things out among taxpayers, 16 giant blue-chip corporations last year paid legally not one penny of taxes.
The fact that 16 companies still don't pay federal income taxes remains a scandal, even after reform.
$123 million. General Motors and IBM say they have paid taxes. Sure, they did, say critics, but then they got those refunds. Big business was right on the spot today to blast the report.
I think it's designed primarily to grab headlines. I think it's a misguided effect to suggest that further corporate tax increases are required.
Still, ordinary taxpayers figure they have to make up the difference.
I think it's disgusting. I think it's disgraceful.
I'd like to have gotten a refund the same as IBM did.
The report adds that if all the companies in its survey paid the regular corporate tax rate of 30%, the government would have collected an extra $70 billion, enough to put a big dent in that huge federal deficit. Ray Brady, CBS News, Washington.
Did tax reform succeed in making profitable companies pay their fair share? We're lucky to have with us today Senator Packwood, one of the heroes of tax reform back in 1986. Senator Bradley will be here soon. He's testifying. Another one of the heroes. Representative Rostenkowski said that he wanted to make it, but he was tied up in the Rules Committee. And the president had to beg off because George Bush persuaded him that with only 3 shopping days left, he'd better get out and get a Christmas present for Nancy. In any event, we do have with us the 2 of the real principal architects, and I want to start today by letting Senator Packwood say a few words. Thank you.
Bob, thank you. When we passed tax reform, we recall the argument of simplicity and fairness, and every time we had to make a decision, we went with fairness rather than simplicity, if that's the bind we're in. And I can give you an example. If you wanted something utterly simple, you could have a flat tax. You tax everybody 10% or 15%. You would have no progressivity in the code, and somebody who made $300,000 would pay 10% tax, and somebody who made $3,000 would pay 10% tax, and that wouldn't be fair. It would be simple. So we were guided by fairness first, and the one thing that I would discover time and again in going home to a coffee shack in Oregon, and lumber is still our big good business, you'd go to the coffee shack, and that day Bob McIntyre would have released his corporate statistics, or IRS would have put out its annual last year, what 284 people made over $500,000 a year and paid no taxes. And the question would come something like this, you know, Senator, I'm working, my husband's working someplace else, and together we're making $29,000 a year, and we pay $1,100 in federal income taxes, and we don't mind paying our fair share, but why aren't they paying something?
Pore over the fine print of the company's annual reports to look and see who's paying taxes and who's not. Because this is our first survey since the passage of tax reform, it's really the first measure of how well our senators and congressmen succeeded in achieving their goal of assuring that no big company will ever again be able to escape its tax responsibilities. And I'm here to tell you that generally the news is very good. 128 of them managed to have at least 1 year where they paid no taxes from 1981 to 1985. In 1987, the number of no-tax companies fell to only 16.
Joining us to explore the implications and wisdom of a cut on the capital gains tax rate, from Washington, James Miller, former director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Reagan and a supporter of a capital gains cut. Also in our D.C. studio, Robert McIntyre, director of Citizens for Tax Justice, a group that opposes the proposed cut. And here in New York, Stephen Axelrod, vice chairman of Nikko Securities and a former staff director at the Federal Reserve Board. Thank you all for joining us. Let me put the first question to you, Steve, because I know we've got some audio problems with our Washington studio right now. Is this a wise move, and could a tax rate cut on capital gains pull a lot of new funds into the stock market?
Well, I think it will pull new funds into the stock market.
Bob McIntyre, I know that you oppose, of course, this particular proposal. You oppose both the president's proposal as well as that of the Boll Weevil Democrats. Why, first of all, if I can get you to summarize your opposition?
Well, I guess it's pretty straightforward here, is that the proposal costs billions and billions of dollars, and most of the money goes to the richest people in the country. It's not fair, and it's bad budget policy.
Does it matter which one? Do you oppose equally both versions of this, and wouldn't the Democratic version be a little bit more acceptable to your group?
Well, only in that it's probably a little less costly. But, I mean, you look at the Bush plan, that costs $71 billion over the next 10 years, according to the Joint Tax Committee. That's more than the S&L bailout. It's more than the stealth bomber.
That 3/4 of the tax returns that show capital gains are people below $50,000 a year.
Yogi Berra said, we're having deja vu all over again. You remember back in the late 70s and early 80s under the Reagan administration, they cut the taxes on the wealthy, they cut the capital gains tax, they said we'd get more savings, more venture capital, all those good things. Nothing like that happened. That's why even President Reagan decided to repeal this tax break, get rid of the tax shelters it had produced, and try to have a free market economy again. It's really distressing to see the Republican Party, which is supposed to believe in markets, say that the answer is, let's have more shelters, let's have more tax subsidies, let's get investors to do things that don't make any sense in the lack of an investment subsidy.
Congress is back from summer vacation, and at the top of its work agenda is whether or not to cut the tax on capital gains. It's one of the most hotly debated issues on Capitol Hill. A Democrat from Michigan, who is a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, with you, Jerry Jasanowski, and ask you where you stand on this issue. What would a cut in capital gains tax mean for you? Are you in favor or against it?
Well, we're in favor of it because I think the world has changed. We're in a very competitive environment. We've got the highest capital gains rate of all the industrialized countries except for one. It would stimulate growth and investment. It goes primarily to the middle class.
First of all, there's the question of equity. It isn't true that most of the benefits would go to middle-income families. We all like to talk about middle-income families, but the Joint Tax Committee study makes it very clear 60% of the benefit from the proposed tax cuts would go to families $200,000 and above, 60%. But there's an issue beyond equity, and that is economic growth. If there were proof that this proposal, or either of them, would generate economic growth, I think I could be for it with a little bit of inequity. But the case hasn't been made. It simply hasn't been made. The only study on this of any seriousness was in 1985 in the Reagan administration, and it showed that over a 50-year period there would be an increase in income from a reduction of the capital gains of 1/4%. That's over 50 years.
Look at history. I mean, my goodness, they cut the capital gains tax in '78. We had 2 recessions after that, including the deepest one since the Great Depression.
Well,
the savings rate, you said it caused economic growth. And furthermore, the savings rate, which is what you're saying is going to go up, plummeted to its lowest levels in our history. So the idea that cutting capital gains taxes is historically going to increase savings, I mean, there's just no evidence of that.
And it's not, I think, contested. 60% of the benefit of the capital gains tax proposal would go to families over $200,000 in income.
The primary issue, first of all, is not equity, as you said, Senator. It's economic growth and competitiveness. But, you know, the numbers I saw indicated, I think, from the IRS that about 50% of this went to individuals with incomes of $50,000 or less.
Well, that's just not true.
Well,
here's what the figures are. Here's what the figures are. I don't remember them exactly, but in terms of numbers, 50%, let's say, of those who would be affected are in the middle income ranges.
All right.
But 60% of the actual gain would go to families with incomes of $200,000 or more. In other words, the people in the middle would have piddling gains, while people who are in the high income ranges would have massive gains. And this is at a time when income distribution is worse than it was 10 years ago.
Gentlemen.
More investment in this country, and more investment means jobs.
The one thing that a temporary tax cut like this one does not do is encourage people to invest for the long term. It encourages them to turn over their assets in order to buy a new Ferrari.
So would this tax cut, as some charge, really add up to a free lunch for America's fat cats, pushing up the already huge federal budget deficit?
These lawyers and accountants will figure out lots of smart ways to change rich people's income into capital gains where it'll be lightly taxed.
According to one study, if you're in the $200,000 a year tax bracket, the cut could save you an average $25,000 a year when you sell. But if you're in the less than $50,000 a year tax bracket, the whole picture changes. You would save $15 a year.
It's about enough to fill up your car with gasoline once.
Ed Andrews begins coverage of election year politics that could affect your pocketbook.
The White House describes the budget summit as an act of good government made necessary by growing economic troubles.
Discussions in good faith and attempt to reach a solution to the problem.
The Democrats are distrustful because they fear Republicans might agree to higher taxes behind closed doors and then blame Democrats in public. They also don't like Republicans floating tax proposals that hit the poor, like gasoline and sales taxes, while talking about cuts in Social Security.
Here's the deal that the Republicans are offering the Democrats. They say, we'll let you, the Democrats, raise taxes on Democrats, and in exchange, you have to let us cut Democratic programs. It's not much of a deal. We have a good news story about taxes. Tax reform, passed in 1986, is working. America's biggest companies are starting to pay taxes again. And they're doing it while reinvesting more than they ever did back when loopholes allowed them to avoid billions of dollars in taxes. Tax reform is working, and it's working well. Contrary to what the loophole lobbyists told us back in 1986, our findings in this study demonstrate that economic growth and tax fairness are natural partners. Overall business investment, including all fixed investment, has risen by 6% a year since tax reform, after a meager 2.1% growth rate in the previous 5 years. Tax reform is working. Now, not all investment is up. The kinds of tax-motivated investments that were hurting our economy have declined. We're not building so many empty office buildings. Buildings that were unwanted, often unneeded, and largely going unrented. Instead, we're investing in competitiveness again. It's a program we need to stick with. Now I'd like to introduce Byron Dorgan of the House Ways and Means Committee, a longtime supporter of tax reform from his days when he was the tax commissioner, the elected tax commissioner of North Dakota.
Tax commissioner of a state, I formed in the Multi-State Tax Commission a national state auditing group so that we would go in and audit large corporations on behalf of many states at one time. And we sent some North Dakota auditors to New York to the headquarters of a large corporation on a Monday morning, and they called me towards noon on Monday and said that the corporation was not letting them in to audit. The corporation attorney called me shortly thereafter and said this, said the fact that we're not letting them in should not be construed to mean that we're keeping them out. In 1986 we did something that was very bold. We embarked on a new philosophy of taxation. In essence, what we said was, if we generally lowered the rates and generally got rid of most of the special deals, everybody would be better off. The very simple concept is extraordinarily important, particularly on the heels of a tax code that for years would allow some enterprises to earn literally hundreds of millions and in some cases billions of dollars and pay less tax than a person that was working digging ditches outside this building making minimum wage. There was something fundamentally wrong with that approach. And the '86 Tax Act said, let's step back and change that approach. This evidence suggests that we've moved in the right direction.
Late last night, the Republican minority placed a capital gains amendment on the Polish-Hungarian aid bill. And I think that really that was somewhat surprising that they would attempt to slow down our efforts to aid the transition to democracy in Poland by injecting this issue once again into the debate. And they're proposing something that's virtually indefensible.
Currently Director of Federal Tax Policy of Citizens for Tax Justice. He has been with that group for 9 years now. Previously was Director of the Tax Reform Research Group.
Hi.
It's my understanding that the Kemp-Roth bill and the 1986 Tax Reform Act raised billions of dollars for the government through lower tax rates for individuals and corporations. Why would we want to raise these rates, and why wouldn't we lower the rates again to stimulate the economy to have additional monies come into the government?
Well, it's a thought, but it's not true. The 81 tax cuts cost the government hundreds of billions of dollars. 86 Tax Reform Act, which tried to undo the 81 Act as best it could, didn't raise money, but it didn't lose money. But our deficit problem today is almost entirely stems from the fact that the government doesn't collect enough money to pay for what it spends. That's even with huge budget cuts in every area of the budget except defense in the 1980s. So tax cuts to raise revenues, it was an idea, it was stupid, it was tried anyway, and it didn't work.
Oh, all right. I'd like to say, what is wrong with having no taxes for the higher income people? This, I think, is an incentive for middle income class people in order to work up to that. And once you've achieved this, you have tax breaks and no taxing, where that's an incentive to invest in American companies.
Well, it's going to be harder to get there if the government has to raise taxes on middle-income people in order to exempt the wealthy. And one thing to keep in mind is that the top fifth of the population makes more than everyone else all put together. So if you're going to exempt them, you're going to have to double taxes on the rest of us. We will never get rich if we have to pay those kind of taxes.
I came because I think that the proposed capital gains cut is an audacious ripoff of the people of this country. To think that we would provide $5 million in tax cuts for about 100 people or more who certainly don't need the money, and to say that we're going to give this kind of a break to the wealthiest Americans while people across the country are fighting to pay for food for their family and clothing, when we so desperately need funds for education and for so many child care, Head Start programs, and to give away this kind of a bonanza is an absurdity.
For those of you who were here in 1986 covering tax reform, Citizens for Tax Justice is the group that put together the coalition of labor and public interest and citizens groups across the country that generated 1 million signatures on a petition for fair taxes. That was a very significant organizing effort, and we're going to make that same kind of effort in this campaign.
Member after member of Congress said they'd only heard from supporters of the capital gains tax break. In other words, their fat cat campaign contributors. They said that despite the polls showing public opposition to this cut, they were going to have to support it because of the pressure from these important constituents. And as a result, George Mitchell had to play Horatio at the bridge to head off enactment of the capital gains break last year. But this year, there aren't going to be any more excuses. 61 public interest groups, labor unions, and citizens groups around this country have joined with us in a grassroots campaign for fair taxes and against this proposed capital gains tax giveaway. In fact, press conferences similar to this one are being held all over the country, places like Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Sacramento, Des Moines, Baton Rouge, Chicago, and we think a few others. The idea of this campaign is very simple. We want to give average families a chance to make their voices heard for a change. This February and March, we plan to circulate millions of our Crumb campaign brochures, envelopes, advertisements, coupons, through publications and through direct contacts by our organizations with their members. The message is, this tax cut is cake for them and crumbs for the rest of us, and we're urging people, quite literally, to send their crumbs back. Right. Sprinkle some crumbs in an envelope, seal it up with a note saying you oppose this, and send it into Congress calling for fair taxes, not more handouts for the wealthy. This country are going to get Congress's attention by dumping their toasters into an envelope and saying, here's some crumbs from my house to show you what I think of a capital gains tax cut. We expect millions of people to take advantage of this chance to let Congress know how they feel. Now over here, as you may have noticed, right in front of me here is a large cake. Now take this cake to represent, let's say, the average tax cut of $25,000 each that goes to these 376,000 rich people. If that's that, here, over in the corner, about this big, is what the average family gets. Or better still, let's look at the $5 million average tax cut that goes to Leona Helmsley and Donald Trump and people like that. Here, on my thumb, is the share that goes to the average family in this country. My friends on this side of the panel, and an honor to be here with some people I don't as often get to see. People I think have some significant and true notoriety in this country for having helped pull off what was probably the biggest financial heist of all time, the 1981 tax bill. And in speaking today, I want to make a distinction between the 81 tax bill and the 86 Tax Reform Act, because they're very different things, and they shouldn't be thought of as part of the same piece of cloth. If you look back at the events that led up to the 81 Tax Act, you'll remember that people were actually saying that a massive tax cut for very wealthy people, and along with what was close to repeal of the corporate income tax, would actually make money for the federal treasury. I'm told, and I've read, that one of the panelists here proved this point on a napkin once. And we all remember President Reagan's famous witticism that he was going to pay for the defense buildup with the revenues generated by the tax cuts. Some of the most egregious predictions along those lines came from areas you wouldn't quite expect it, from the business community. The idea of the huge corporate tax cut, which was the heart of the 81 tax bill that President Reagan was proposing, was so attractive to the corporate lobbying community that the Business Roundtable of all groups sent a lobbyist down to the Ways and Means Committee to say that the corporate executives had thought it over and, I quote, believe that the President's plan will trigger increased revenues, although they did put a caveat there that it might take more than 1 year. We also had people saying at the time that these tax cuts, despite all the evidence to the contrary, were going to be across the board, that they're going to be fair to all income groups. That was the standard line of the day. You even had people, and I include David Stockman and Richard Rahn, saying that adopting a whole set of new tax loopholes, which was the heart of the 81 Act, as I said, along with rate reductions, would actually curb tax shelters. In fact, Richard said it might eliminate abusive tax shelters. That was in his testimony. We had people like from the National Machine Tools Association saying it would foster international competitiveness. In fact, the Chemical Manufacturers Association said it was virtually certain to have a positive effect on U.S. trade. And of course, it was also said at the time that passage of the 81 Tax Act would instantaneously lead to an economic boom. The retroactive business tax cuts designed to encourage business investments that had already been made, and the expectation of lower marginal rates were going to lead to an instantaneous boom. Richard ran it through the Chamber of Commerce computer model and said that there would be a rapid improvement in the economy, a drop in unemployment and inflation, a rise in productivity, real GNP, and workers' pay all the way through the end of the forecast period, which was 1983, immediately. So let's not talk about a delayed cut, Mr. Laffer. This was the prediction at the time by the proponents. Now, it's hard to believe anybody really thought these things when you think about it. Stockman, of course, has admitted that it was just a Trojan horse for trickle-down economics. But some people clearly did believe it. Indeed, it wouldn't be surprising today, it isn't surprising today, to hear people saying that the supply-side tax shift program actually worked. That it worked because it had to work. The logic of it is it had to work. And so does ideology blind people to the facts. So let's look what happened. Well, the deficit was not reduced. It skyrocketed. As Rudy has pointed out, the national debt tripled. Savings and investment didn't pick up. And the economy certainly didn't turn instantaneously upward.
Instead, as the Fed cracked down in response to the expected supply-side deficits, we had the worst recession since the 1930s. And clearest of all, despite the talk of across-the-board tax changes, the rich saw their taxes slashed. Middle and low-income people saw their taxes go up with inflation and higher payroll taxes, while incomes for average people stagnated. Now, all of these pernicious effects were predicted by many of us before the bill was passed. Look what else happened. Despite the rate cuts, and certainly because of all these so-called incentives that were adopted in the '81 Tax Act, productive business investment kept being crowded out by a huge surge in wasteful tax shelters, not to mention by increased federal borrowing. Now look, it's not hard to understand that with the government borrowing huge sums of money to subsidize unproductive, uneconomic private investments, that productive investment is bound to suffer, and it did. Reported tax shelter losses reached $150 billion by 1986. Meanwhile, real business investment grew at only 2.1% a year from '81 to '86, and investment in industrial plant and equipment actually fell. We went from a trade surplus to a huge trade deficit. Savings by individuals fell to record lows. Finally, the negative effects of the '81 Act became so clear that even President Reagan had second thoughts. So the Reagan administration put forward what became the '86 Tax Reform Act, in which they curbed shelters, they closed down loopholes, and they ended up having some positive economic effects. Business investment picked up finally after 1986. We saw more investment in plant and equipment after '86. We saw a start towards a return towards tax fairness. But where we stand now, unfortunately, is that we're still paying for the '81 changes. We still have a national debt we need to deal with. We still have an unfair tax system. What our goal should be for the future is not to redo something like 1981, but instead to continue in the spirit of 1986, to try to restore fairness and economic common sense to our tax code, not take a riverboat gamble with a stacked deck.
Thank you, Bob. Specific rebuttal, which they would like to throw out. Jay, let's start on the right. Art?
I'd just like to get Rudy Penner a little bit on this deficit. I mean, I've heard about it a lot, and I shrinkingly want to crawl under a rock and confess guilt. But I, in my view, and this is different from I think Richard and maybe Larry's as well, is the deficits were a godsend. The only reason spending stopped where it did was because the deficits were there and they really couldn't have gone any further. That was the only constraint placed on Congress and the administration.
Mr. McIntyre noted that I had said there would be an economic boom after the Reagan program was put in place. That is indeed exactly what happened. The program was not put in place in '81 and '82 when you had recession, Bob. That was put in place. The recession was caused by the Carter policies. No.
Richard wants to disavow himself of his predictions in 1981, but he did make them and did predict instantaneous results from the Reagan tax cut, not results after 1983.
Tax cuts were put in, Bob. They were delayed, as you might remember, in 1981. They were not put in until as part of
we have a factual dispute, ladies and gentlemen. I recommend you read the Ways and Means record, which I did yesterday. I recommend that you probably stay away from it, though. People have been convoluting the Social Security trust fund rating of the 1980s with the rest of the budget here for a while, and I thought it would be worthwhile to take a look at the budget without Social Security, because I think Reagan succeeded admirably or disadmirably, depending on your point of view, at cutting the areas of spending that he wanted to cut. If you leave out the Social Security system, which is paid for and is surplus, what you find is that the Reagan administration and the Bush administration are spending far more on defense, interest, and the savings and loan bailout, which was to a large degree a product of their crack regulators. You look at the whole rest of the government, and it's down in inflation-adjusted dollars by $140 billion in 1990. They cut roads, they cut education, they cut the criminal justice system, they cut welfare, and everything else in the government by 20 to 40% as a share of the GNP. The only things that are up are defense, which they wanted to be up, and interest, which is a result of their deficit policies. So don't think that they just gave middle-class and low-income people higher taxes. They also gave them lower services, and they did a heck of a job at it.
why don't we get a referendum on the federal ballot and just redistribute the stock and the money and the real estate and goes to everybody, divide her all up, and redeal this monopoly game?
You certainly posed some interesting thoughts.
Mr. McIntyre?
Well, one thing the caller, probably has noticed, there's been a lot of redistribution over the last 15 years, but it's been redistribution up. It came out of the pockets of poor people and middle-class people, and it went to rich people. And his sentiment that we ought to take some back is absolutely correct. Whether we do it with a referendum on the ballot or just change the tax laws so that the wealthy people start paying taxes again is a different question. I think the latter is probably a little simpler, and that's what we ought to be thinking about doing.
Madison, Wisconsin. Go right ahead.
Thank you. I'm calling in regards to this tax debate you've been talking off and on about here. And you're pitting people against people, the rich against the working class and everything else. Why don't they just do away with all these deductions, write-offs, charge everybody a straight percent right across the board, the same percent from zero income to the billionaires. Everybody pays their fair share. Get rid of all these audits, everybody pays, and there's no cheating. I think this simplistic plan might sound simple in its form, but it would...
Thanks for calling.
Thank you.
Mr. McIntyre?
Going to a flat tax where you have the same rate whether you make $5,000 or $5 billion, I think is a bad system. Poor people should pay less. Middle-income people should pay less than the very rich. We should have progressive rates. If you took the current system, for instance, and wanted to raise the same money with a flat rate, you'd have about a 20% rate or so. That would be a 33% tax increase on most people and a 33% tax cut on the richest people. We don't need that. So the sentiment, get rid of deductions and special breaks, I think that's a good idea. But go to a flat rate? No.
I'm calling about the Federal Reserve and the Trilateral Commission. And the Council on Foreign Relations is the most powerful clique in the elitist group, and they have one objective, and they want to bring about the surrender of the sovereignty and the national independence of the United States. It is intended to be a vehicle for multinational consolidation of the commercial and banking interests by seizing control of the political government of the United States.
Thanks for calling, ma'am. Reaction, Mr. McIntyre?
I think she's a nut.
Democrats are saying, look, let's at least reverse that, make things a little fairer, stop giving away the store to the top 1%. And that's what President Bush says he can't tolerate.
But practically speaking, President Bush is going to veto anything that comes out of the Congress right now anyway.
It's hilarious. They have given him every single thing in his package, every single stupid loophole that he asked for.
Except
in
for
his State of the Union, they gave him capital gains, passive losses.
But he said he
will
not
accept it. And he's vetoing it anyway,
yes, but he
just
said that
because of a middle-class tax cut.
Because of a middle-class tax cut.
That is paid for by raising taxes on the top 1%.
Which is the reason that President Bush would veto it.
Isn't that amazing? 1% of the people, he says his economic program would be good for the country. All this stupid capital gains and everything, he's vetoing that just because of the top 1% of the population. He's not serious about the loopholes, and he understands they wouldn't help the economy. He's just posturing to win the Republican primary.
Is it that simple, Steve?
No, there's no economist in the world who thinks that this top rate increase in the marginal tax rates is a good idea.
Taxes are up. They are up on the middle class. They're down on the very rich. On the spending side, Social Security's up. We got more old people. Social Security taxes pay for that and more. We all know it.
That's not true.
The rest of the government is down by a quarter, and he knows that.
The richest 1% are paying more income taxes today than they were in 1981.
Well, you know, there's been a little inflation since then. Their incomes have doubled, their taxes haven't come close to keeping pace, and everybody knows it. The New York Times just put out a study 2 weeks ago that showed that 5/6 of the income growth over the last 15 years went to the top 1%. It's crazy. We're like a banana republic.
How much does the top 1% make? How much do you have to make to be in the top 1%?
It's roughly people making more than $200,000. Their average income is about $600,000.
$200,000. Their adjusted gross income over $200,000?
Total income.
Total income.
Their average income is about $600 each.
Okay. Well, okay, so cut everybody's taxes. Everybody agrees with that.
No,
across the board.
I see. All right.
Absolutely not. The last thing we want is bigger deficits. It's what's the problem in this country today.
In New York, all of a sudden, Clinton's debate is with Jerry Brown, not George Bush. He began with Brown's proposal for a flat 13% tax on all personal and business income.
We do not need another idea. It sounds simple, sounds appealing, appeals to legitimate resentments, but makes the problem worse.
It would be
both much more efficient in terms of stimulating economic growth and a much smaller burden in terms of record keeping and filing for most people.
Others are sharply critical.
Well, the Brown plan from many points of view is a fraud, and revenue is the first one.
The federal government would take in $200 billion less under the Brown plan, according to the Citizens for Tax Justice. That would almost double this year's deficit. The group study also says Brown's plan would hurt middle and low-income families. For example, people making $25,000 or less now pay an average of 6.7% in taxes. That would go up to 13%. People who make $100,000 or more a year now pay 22% in income taxes alone. That would go down to 13%. In addition, the group says the business tax would be passed on to consumers. That would hit low-income families hardest because they spend a higher percentage of their income on essential goods and services.
Because it cuts taxes on very high-income people tremendously, and it raises taxes on everybody else. That's not a liberal program. That's to the far, far wacky right.
When asked about specific criticisms, Brown mostly dismisses them.
The economists will argue about it, and I'm telling you, the poor and the middle class will be better off. The whole nation will be better off.
Brown says if anything about his flat tax does hurt the poor, he would make up for that by spending more government money to help them. When asked where the money would come from, Brown says, Congress. Bob Jameson, ABC News, New York.
Style and habits have endeared him to a lot of people. But others have thought over the years he sometimes looks silly.
For the present King George Bush.
It was columnist Mike Royko who dubbed him Governor Moonbeam, a moniker that is stuck like tar paper.
Do you resent it when people call you Governor Moonbeam?
I have, but I'm getting used to it. Because I've now seen that one moonbeam is worth 1,000 points of light. The mandarins down there within the Beltway were already anointing Governor Clinton, and within a matter of a few days, that all was brought into question.
Governor, even after your Connecticut victory, I read the newspapers the next morning, and they still said, everyone knows that you're not going to be the nominee.
Well, if not me, who?
Brown has a point. There's no one else left in the race, so any Stop Clinton movement has to center on him. Governor Mario Cuomo, when asked whether either Clinton or Brown were electable, replied that anybody is electable who's decent and intelligent and isn't carrying a dead body in a sack on his shoulders.
15% on gross income.
The flat tax. Brown calls it a silver bullet cure-all for the economy. Nobody...
It would put a silver bullet through the heart of Social Security.
Brown's tax plan is radical, and he says original.
If it isn't the only new idea in this campaign, at least it's close to being that.
But the flat tax idea goes back to a 1981 newspaper article and a 1985 book, co-authored by Stanford University economist Robert Hall. He still thinks it's a good idea.
What most families would file would be a tax form that looks like this. It fits easily on a postcard, eliminates all the myriad of complex forms that many people have to file today.
Even Hall says Brown's version of the flat tax would be unfair.
I think the central problem with the Brown proposal as it stands is that it's not progressive. It needs to be changed to make it progressive, to make it fair to lower income families.
Citizens for Tax Justice, a group funded by labor unions, calls Brown's tax plan, quote, stupid.
Middle-income people will see their taxes go up under Brown's plan. So would poor people. I mean, it has to figure. If you're going to cut taxes on the rich in half, somebody's got to make it up.
According to McIntyre's analysis, families earning an average of $8,270 a year, the lowest one-fifth of U.S. earners, would see their total federal taxes increase from 6.7% currently to more than 26% under Brown's plan. Middle-income families would pay slightly more, but the richest 1% would pay much less, according to the study.
The big winners under the Brown plan are the same people that have been big winners throughout the 1980s, the very rich. Their taxes would be cut tremendously under the Brown plan by 40%, even 50%. And guess who has to make it up? Everybody else, the middle class and the poor.
Go ahead with your question or comment.
Yes, Mr. Ettlinger, I'd like to ask you what the association of David Wilhelm has been with your... Well, it's a good question. You can smile if you want. There's a lot of people that know the association with Citizens Tax Justice. Is that correct or wrong?
I can only hear part of that, but I will...
Is there an association with...
Campaign director.
Right, David.
Exactly right. Go ahead.
Yeah, David was our executive director up till 6 years ago. I know David. He is the campaign manager, director with the Clinton campaign. But we've been bashing the flat tax for 10 years.
Continuing our survey of the advice available to the new young president, joining us now is Robert McIntyre. He is director of Citizens for Tax Justice, a nonpartisan public interest group. Good morning.
Good morning.
As briefly as possible, what are the major tax change areas you are going to be recommending to the Clinton people?
Well, in a nutshell, what Bill Clinton needs to do to be successful next year and throughout his term is to deal with the long-term deficit while he stimulates the economy. That means he's going to have to reverse the Reagan tax shift that cut taxes so much for rich people and corporations over the long term. And that means he has to raise the tax rates on high-income people and big companies. He's going to have to close down some of the loopholes that are still left in the law.
Changes people are liable to feel during the next year?
Well, these won't affect most people, but the kinds of changes Clinton should be thinking about are raising the tax rate on people that make more than $200,000, raising the corporate rate on the biggest companies, closing down loopholes that encourage bad economic behavior, primarily on corporations and investors, and getting the free market system to work and getting the government to stop borrowing. Most people won't have to pay higher taxes if he does that, but the government will collect the money it needs to pay for its spending.
Has your group forwarded these recommendations to the Clinton team?
We sure have.
Some new polls show more Americans behind the president's plan for recovery. A Time magazine CNN survey says 62% approve of Clinton's economic strategy, and more than 70% believe they should make sacrifices. More good news for the president. His approval ratings are up 6 points since the last month. Joining us now to take a closer look at the tax package is Robert McIntyre, Director of Citizens for Tax Justice. Mr. McIntyre, some positive poll numbers we just saw. Do they surprise you, or do you think that they'll be changing when it comes time to pay the bill?
Well, you know, you look at this plan and you say they're cutting the deficit by $140 billion, and it costs the typical middle-income family $200. I think most people are seeing that as a pretty good deal. I think overall it's a fair plan. They have targeted their tax hikes on those who can afford to pay them, the wealthiest people, and they have not taxed the poor anymore, and the middle class has to chip in a little, but it's not that bad. There are some detail problems, of course. We all have detail problems.
What are some of those vulnerable parts of the tax plan that may not get support in the months to come?
Well, you know, there's interest groups all over this town, and every one of them who's touched by it, whether it's the oil industry or the restaurant owners or whatever, will be in there lobbying. I think ultimately, though, you're going to see something very similar to this pass the Congress. From my own point of view, I'm trying to take some of the loopholes out.
Loopholes, specifically, what kinds of loopholes? Are they new, or are they remaining from carryover past administrations?
Well, it's both, but there are some new ones in there that the president has in there either inadvertently or maybe because he thinks they could help the economy that we think really are bad economics, so we're going to be suggesting to them that they clean up the plan a little as it moves along. But nevertheless, overall, it's a real good deal plan for average people.
Director of Citizens for Tax Justice, a nonprofit research group whose members include labor unions and grassroots organizations, and David Keating, Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union, a nonprofit membership organization that opposes higher taxes. Mr. Keating, what in a nutshell, now I realize your organization opposes just about every kind of tax increase, am I right about that?
That's right.
Are the tax increases fair, the way they're constructed?
I think if you're going to ask people to pay more, it would be fairer to ask people who are wealthier. But the idea of talking about taxes and fairness, they're mutually contradictory terms.
Well, wait. I mean, let's talk about this in context. We've had a lot of tax changes over the last decade or so, and most of them went, the big ones went in one direction. They gave big tax cuts to rich people. And what Clinton is saying, he's going to take back some of that. I calculate he takes back about 1/3 or so of the Reagan-era tax cut.
But how can he take those? I mean, that money's already been
take back
spent.
what they're getting now. You know, that tax cut, this year, the rich get a $70 billion tax cut every year. They get that in lower taxes compared to what they used to have to pay. Clinton's taking back some of that. And that's good.
There are many unthings.
Let me say, though, by the way, there is a concern about this package that while he's undoing the bad side of Reaganomics,
he's also undoing, to some degree, some of the good things that happened in the late 60s, late 80s, with reforming the tax code and getting rid of some of the loopholes.
Give me an example.
Well, for example, their plan raises the top tax rate on the very richest people to about 40%. That's pretty high, but it's fine. But they leave capital gains at 28. Now, that's a 30% exclusion for capital gains, just like Bush wanted. And what it's going to mean is there's going to be a lot of accountants and lawyers working very hard to change their clients' income from regular high tax to low tax capital gains.
Explain to me how that would work. Just give me an example that I can understand of how somebody would use that to escape taxes.
For instance, let's say I'm in that high bracket. I've got my eye on some timber property. I'll buy that and deduct all my costs of growing these trees against my 40% tax rate and save 40 cents for every dollar I spend. And then when I sell my timber property, I'll pay capital gains at 28. Well, that's magic, because I'm going to be able to spend $100, but only cost me 60. And then when I take my profit out, it's a 28% tax. I'll make more money after tax than I do before tax. And the accountants and lawyers will be all over this if it passes. I hope they fix it.
Are you going to fix that, Ms. Rubin? Do you agree that that's a problem?
No, we're not going to fix that.
Is looking at a 10% surcharge on taxable income over $250,000.
Well, it's actually on the tax.
On the tax. This would hit the people who did very well under Reaganomics. Is there any evil in this?
If we imply a surtax on the tax over $250,000, all that's going to happen is that rich people are going to shelter and underreport and hide their income. In the 1980s, when we cut tax rates, the rich paid a much larger share of the income tax burden than they did before. Lower taxes lead to more income, and higher taxes actually paid by the wealthy.
That's just silly.
Okay, no,
just silly.
But it's true.
No, it's not
it's
true.
in the IRS data.
After the Reagan tax cut of '81, even though the rich's income went up unbelievably much, their share of the tax burden went down, 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 and we only brought it back with the '86 Reform Act. Dan was against.
Well,
I was for it, by the way.
I have seen figures that for the top 1% of taxpayers from 1977 to 1992, their tax rates dropped 18%.
When they weren't putting it in investments that created jobs.
All right, let's agree on something, Dan. We're against tax shelters, and we don't want to have them. Now,
but are we also in favor of economic growth?
Let's understand how Reagan cut taxes for the wealthy in 1981.
He cut taxes
for everybody. The primary way
he
cut taxes for the wealthy was to introduce new tax shelters. Now, I assume you're against that now. Good. Let's not go back to that policy. What we did in 1986, and what we should continue to do, is close down these shelters. Now, that may make the wealthy pay more taxes, but you and I can agree on that at least. That tax sheltering
we have to define
is bad.
what a tax shelter
so
is.
let's talk about what Clinton ought to do in his tax program. The right thing to do is to get rid of the remaining shelters.
Who will win the battle of the budget tonight in the Senate? Wendy Rieger has the latest now from Capitol Hill. Wendy?
And waiting and waiting and still waiting. They have been busy all day tweaking this budget package, or trying to. The Senate Republicans, as you can imagine, are not real happy with it. They've spent the day introducing amendments that would remove many of the tax increases. They have failed.
Taxes, taxes, taxes.
They're still fighting over the Senate plan, but it's the final round. After a day of negotiations, the Democrats expect to have the votes to pass a tax package. This morning at the Capitol.
There's been so much misinformation put out about this plan that a lot of what we have been doing in the last 6 weeks or so is just trying to get the facts out.
Has been misinformation, some of it from the president, some from his opponents. First, the size of the package.
The largest deficit reduction in history. Nearly $500 billion.
Not true, says Martha Phillips of the bipartisan Concord Coalition. And spending cuts.
And it reduces government spending by more than $250 billion.
Again, not true. The bill actually cuts less than $100 billion. The rest is cuts promised in the future. But the opposition also has taken liberty with the truth. First, tax increases.
This plan is not just the largest tax increase in American history, but the largest tax increase in world history.
Not true. A 1982 Reagan tax increase, which Dole voted for, was larger.
I guess you might call it the biggest tax increase since Reagan's first term. But the biggest in history? Not even close.
Finally, the deficit.
Does the president's plan reduce the deficit? The answer is no.
That's certainly not true.
Obfuscation has long been a Washington tradition, but in this debate, it was raised to an art form. Lisa Myers, NBC News, the Capitol.
This is Issues and Answers.
And some have said in the past there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. Well, there's not a dime's worth of difference. There's $290 billion worth of difference. $290 billion in gross new taxes. $275 billion in gross new taxes and $15 billion in user fees. That adds up to $290 billion.
Mr. Reagan come along and said to the American people, now, Mr. American people, I want you. You are called to large, fateful duties in this decade that will demand things of you. We are going to have to arm against the Soviet Union. And to do so, Mr. President, we're going to have to do so, Mr. and Miss America, I'm going to have to cut your taxes 40%. Well, many a brave citizen rallied to that challenge. Not the most.
After weeks of debate and dire warnings from both sides of the aisle, it is a done deal. Congress has passed and President Clinton has signed into law a $500 billion deficit reduction plan. Hello, I'm Jim Clark, and welcome to Issues and Answers. The President's economic package was aimed at reversing runaway deficit spending. It passed by the narrowest of margins, a single vote in both the House and Senate, with not a single Republican voting for it in either House.
This is just the beginning, just the first step in our attempts to assert control over our financial affairs, to invest in our future, and to grow our economy.
Well, have we started to get our economic house in order, as the President claims, or is the budget package political smoke and mirrors? With us to discuss this and other issues are Robert McIntyre, Director of Citizens for Tax Justice. That is a coalition of labor, public interest, and citizens groups advocating progressive tax reform for ordinary working Americans. McIntyre, he promised throughout the campaign
No, what he promised in the campaign. Doesn't anybody remember this campaign? It was Ross Perot out there saying shared sacrifice. And Perot meant by shared sacrifice, sock it to the middle class, sock it to the poor. Bill Clinton, who got elected, by the way, said no. What we're going to do when we get elected is cut the deficit by taking back these enormous tax cuts that Reagan gave wealthy people. And that's exactly what this program does. It cuts defense spending, where it's excessive, and it raises taxes on the rich. That was the right thing to do. And right now we have a plan that's extremely progressive. 80% of the new tax revenues from people who make more than $200,000 a year. It's what Clinton promised. And to say, well, gee, you promised during the campaign you'd be Ross Perot. No, he didn't. Bob Kerrey may think the middle class needs to get soaked. Bill Clinton didn't, and that's why he got elected, and that's why this program passed.
Dan Mitchell, what's your response to that?
Well, I seem to recall during the campaign that Bill Clinton promised a middle-class tax cut. As a matter of fact,
you're right, and they didn't get this.
If you go back to the newspapers back in May, you can find writers saying, well, Bill Clinton's promising more tax cuts than tax increases, and instead of doing that, he turns around and gives us a tax increase that is huge by anybody's measures, and it's not going to create a single job. It's not going to result in a lower budget deficit. It's not going to result in a lower national debt.
No, wait a minute. Of course it's going to create jobs, and of course it's going to
create government jobs, but it'll destroy jobs on net.
It's going to lower interest rates. Now, Dan and the Reagan administration that he thinks so highly of thought it was fine to run the highest real interest rates in history in this country. They thought it was fine to stifle business investment, to make it impossible for people to buy homes and cars. They thought that was the way to run the economy as long as rich people got theirs. And this is a turnaround in policy that's pro-investment, that's going to get us back towards an even keel. There's more to do. There's no doubt about that. But this gets us started in the right direction, and that direction is towards a more pro-investment economy, not the consumption by the rich policies that we had under Reagan and Bush.
I'd be willing to bet anybody $10 that government will be bigger as a percentage of GDP 4 years from now than it is today. I'm sure I won't get any offers on that. Where should they cut?
Yeah, I'll bet you on that.
I will take a cut any place. At Heritage, we've endorsed cuts in defense spending. I'm in favor of getting rid of whole departments on the level of the federal government. The only way to cut spending...
Which one would you get rid of?
Department of Education, Department of Energy, Department of Labor, Department of Housing and Urban Development. You're talking to someone who thinks that 90% of what the government does is bad for the economy and that those resources would be better left in the productive sector of the economy.
So we're going to get rid of Social Security and everything else except interest, apparently. Interest is about 20%, so you can't quite get
Actually, it's about 14%, so maybe 90% is a bit of an exaggeration.
So 85% of the government you'd eliminate, and we'd be left with the government only paying interest. That'd be a heck of a government.
There's nothing Americans hate more than paying taxes. And the new 104th Congress has the remedy, the flat tax.
The American people are fed up with a tax system that drives them crazy.
We will be talking about flat taxes.
A flat tax, in my estimation, is an idea that has an enormous appeal with America.
It's the brainchild of House Majority Leader Dick Armey of Texas, and it sounds simple.
It was pioneered by Professors Hall and Rabushka at the Hoover Institution. And after all their hard work, we added 10 months of our own, and we came up. Sam, let me give each of you a copy of the tax form for the future. This is the flat tax form that Americans will be filing.
Well, those who oppose it, and there are quite a few, first complaint they offer is that it is regressive. What do you respond? How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I disagree with that. Quite frankly, we are having that checked again, the whole question of regressivity. What you see cited is two studies, one by the Citizens of Tax Justice, which has been proven to be wrong, and one by the the Treasury Department, which they themselves now admit was a wrong study.
You don't tax any unearned income, do you?
Well, there is no such thing, first of all, as unearned income. That's a fiction.
It's a terrible idea, and we have to count on the Senate to bail out the House and not pass this monstrosity.
Yeah, Mr. Mitchell made a point about not believing that the government or anyone else should play Robin Hood, and I think it's a good point, although Robin Hood is one of my heroes when I was a kid. But perhaps the economy as a whole should be of greater interest. Now, how would you respond to that? Granted that this favors the rich, granted that it favors the corporations, but is it good for the economy? That should be the question.
Well, that's a very good question. And first of all, it's not good for the economy because it adds so much to the deficit. Secondly, it's not good for the economy because the way it's structured, this is a collection of corporate and high-income welfare items that you only get if you invest in tax shelters. And that's what this bill will give us. People and companies will start investing in stupid things based on tax reasons rather than doing the right thing, which is invest in what the market demands. It's really like socialism from Republicans.
Let's get one thing clear here. Republicans aren't talking about increasing the deficit. They're talking about cutting spending and cutting taxes, and they're going to cut spending by more than they cut taxes. So this is part of a comprehensive package, as was promised last November, to reduce the size and burden of government. That's what the American people gave Republicans a mandate for, and for the special interest groups in Washington to say, oh, how terrible, Republicans are following their promise, I think that's something that's refreshing to the American people.
Well, I'd like to see the Republicans take this to the public and say, look, here's our plan. We're going to make sure that General Electric and General Dynamics don't pay taxes anymore.
Well, they took it to the public November 8th, 1994.
The public didn't vote for no-tax corporations, and it didn't vote for tax shelters, and it didn't vote for tax cuts for rich people. This is not what the public wants.
This was in the contract with America.
And nobody read the contract. They had polls on it. 15% of the public had any idea what was in it.
Well, I think
now they're going to be sadly surprised to see the Republicans going back to their old policy of big deficits and big tax cuts for the high-income people, and they know what's going to happen to them. The public is going to end up paying for this.
Is there a tax increase that you would support, Mr. Mitchell?
Maybe on government workers, but no, I want a flat tax. I want true fairness.
That's a tax increase. Now, Dan, if you want a flat tax, that's going to raise taxes, like the Dick Armey plan you like, about $1,700 per American family, just so they can cut it by $50,000 each for the rich. You do support tax increases.
The Army flat tax cuts taxes for everybody. The worst criticism you can make is that it would increase the deficit, but of course Army does have spending cuts as well.
I know you don't care about the deficit, but his plan, if it's revenue neutral, raises taxes on most Americans. That is the Heritage Foundation program, ladies and gentlemen.
This bill would really cut the capital gains in half?
No, more. It cuts it in half, and then it cuts it in half again. It's about a two-thirds cut overall.
It should be eliminated. Most of our major trading partners don't tax capital gains at all. We're shackling our own economy.
Untrue. That's not true. He's making it up again.
What's the long-term capital gains rate in Hong Kong and Taiwan and Singapore and West Germany and country after country?
I didn't know that Hong Kong was the model the United States was aiming for. I've been there.
I wish we would follow Hong Kong. It's been the fastest-growing economy in the world since World War II.
Well, I wonder if Americans want to live the way the people in Hong Kong do. I'd be interested.
Especially after 1997.
Will reach any conclusions before the week's over?
Well, it's going to reach a conclusion because the Republicans are going to take a vote on it in the House. So we'll know, obviously, what's going to happen by the end of the week.
Are you sure they're going to take a vote on it?
Oh, I'm quite sure. The one thing that has been an ironclad commitment of the new Speaker, and that is to vote on all 10 items in the contract with America. He's called this the crown jewel, so I think it's pretty clear he's going to vote on it by the end of the week.
Will you be happy when the end of the week comes and you see the vote?
I hope so. So far, we've been pretty happy with what they've done in the first 9 items, except for term limits. Weren't too happy with that, but everything else has turned out pretty well.
Robert McIntyre of Citizens for Tax Justice, will you be happy?
Well,
he's never happy.
You know what's going to happen this week? They're going to pass this tax cut bill, even though they know it's completely irresponsible and targeted to rich people and a terrible thing for the country. And you know why they're going to pass it? Because they know that either the Senate or President Clinton is going to bail them out, and this bill is not going to become law in anything like its current form. And they'll be happy about that because they know they can't afford $600 or $700 billion in new tax cuts at the time when they're trying to balance the budget. What we're talking about here is tax cuts that are more than $100 billion a year. They're gigantic. And the idea of passing them in the face of hoping to balance the budget is nuts. And then you look at the details and it gets nuttier still. This is a repeat of the Reagan policies of the early 80s when we got all the tax shelters, all the big corporations paying no taxes, all the bad economic effects of people doing things for tax reasons rather than economic reasons. It's a terrible piece of legislation.
Citizens for Tax Justice, what is it?
Well, we're a coalition of groups from labor unions to the League of Women Voters to grassroots groups around the country. And our goal, and our single goal, is to make the tax code fairer so that middle and low-income people get a better shake out of it.
Did you personally have an experience someplace in your life that made you what you are, in your opinion? What was your family like? What did your dad do?
Well, my father was the mayor of my town right before I was born, and kept an interest in political events when he practiced law in Attleboro, Massachusetts. And yeah, we grew up with a strong religious background and a strong commitment to fairness.
Are you a partisan in politics?
Not at all. We're nonpartisan as can be. Some of my best friends are Republicans.
Mr. McIntyre, if you woke up this morning, as you did, and picked up the Los Angeles Times, as you might have, and saw this headline on the front page by a story by Melissa Healy, and the headline is, GOP aims to cut firms' corporate welfare. Republicans seeking savings for tax cuts. They're due to release a hit list of targeted companies. Would you believe it?
I'd be very happy about it. Would I believe it? No. Every time they talk about cutting corporate welfare, it turns out they want to raise millions. And every time they talk about increasing corporate welfare, it turns out to be billions. That's 3 more zeros on the side of bigger ones, and no, I don't believe them.
This is supposed to be led by Senator Phil Gramm, this effort.
Phil Gramm has proposed to eliminate the corporate income tax.
Of New Jersey, he's a tax cut proponent. Opposing the cuts is Bob McIntyre, director of Citizens for Tax Justice.
It's a deficit time bomb, for starters. They've got an estimate that it's $190 billion over 5 years, but after that, as they'd have to admit, it's $100 billion every year. That's an increase in the deficit of almost 50%, and it's a hole we don't need to get into if we need to balance the budget.
200,000, 95,000, you support either one of those tax cuts?
I think a tax credit for middle-income people, not for rich people like they want, but for middle-income people might be nice. The problem is that they're borrowing the money to do it, and that the kids are going to have to pay it back. That's not good family policy.
He also says it makes a point about how people get ahead. They need to be encouraged to invest, and if all the money is going to taxes, people won't save, and businesses won't create jobs.
Well, this is targeting tax breaks to big companies that won't pay any taxes at all. That doesn't encourage growth. That encourages tax sheltering. We tried that in the early 80s. It was such a bad policy, even President Reagan said, wait a minute, let's stop doing this nutty kind of thing. Let's go back and make the tax code fair. And that's what we did in 1986. They want to go back to the bad old days.
Well, I want to go back to President Kennedy, who advocated cutting capital gains taxes.
He advocated raising capital gains taxes.
When he cut capital gains taxes, you had tremendous economic growth.
I do want to ask you about the corporate tax, so this question of repealing the alternative minimum tax. Now, a lot of people say, wait a minute, why should corporations not be paying some kind of tax?
A lot of jobs, and it's making life miserable for small and big businesses because it's an accounting nightmare.
Right. I'm going to leave it on that just quickly.
Well, let me just what you should understand is that companies are complaining this is complicated. They've never found anything too complicated that cut their taxes, and nothing is simple enough if it makes them pay.
What about this meeting today with the Republicans?
Well, there's a meeting 9 o'clock this morning, which Newt Gingrich will give an inspirational speech. I think that we will have the votes this week, and I anticipate it will be enacted Wednesday or Thursday.
You say the message is going to be vote for it because the Senate will kill it? Is that
Absolutely. The House members, even the ones who know it's a terrible thing, will vote for it. They promise to do something stupid, they'll do it. They know the Senate or President Clinton will bail them out.
A lot of people in my district that were actually keeping our promises instead of breaking them and raising taxes the way the President did.
Congressman Zimmer, Bob McIntyre, thank you both for coming in.
Capital gains taxes set off a hot fight. You risk money on an investment, but if you sell at a profit, Uncle Sam takes as much as a 28% whack right out of your gain.
This is
too much, say Republicans. They propose a cut to 19.8% and promise great results.
I am very strongly in favor of cutting capital gains in order to create jobs.
When the tax rate comes down, people sell a lot more. When they sell a lot more, the government collects more revenue.
Professor George Zodro has analyzed the proposed cut. His conclusion?
The net effect on the economy, including any job creation, would have to be relatively modest.
What this is about is cutting taxes for wealthy people. And all these arguments you hear about economics just don't hold water.
That's because McIntyre's group, using IRS figures, estimates that 1994's capital gains taxes will reach nearly $32 billion. 68% of that will come from people making over $200,000.
Out there now will increase the deficit and increase taxes on all Americans with incomes of under $200,000 a year.
My general view would be the closer we could get to a true flat tax without deductions, the simpler the system would be and the better it would be.
From Washington, Crossfire. On the left, Mike Kinsley. On the right, John Sununu. Tonight, flat tax debate in the Crossfire. Grover Norquist, President of Americans for Tax Reform, and Bob McIntyre, Director of Citizens for Tax Justice.
Good evening, welcome to Crossfire, and happy Tax Day. If you haven't filed yet, you've got until midnight tonight to send in your 1994 income tax return. As taxpayers struggle with the complications of Form 1040, they often think there must be a better way. And several leading Republicans are pushing what they claim is a better way, the flat tax. House Majority Leader Dick Armey, for example, says eliminate all the deductions for home mortgage interest, for charity contributions, and so on, and tax everyone at a flat 17%. But he also says exempt interest, dividends, and capital gains from all taxes to encourage savings. Skeptics say this would add up to a big tax cut for the rich and a big tax increase for the middle class. The Treasury says it also would increase the deficit by almost $200 billion a year. Only three things are inevitable in this world: death, taxes, and John Sununu. John?
Bob McIntyre, anybody who struggled over the 1040 over the last few months trying to get their taxes in knows the system is too complicated, too arcane, too designed for lawyers to interpret it. What is wrong with making the system simpler and more efficient to collect?
Making it simpler and more efficient is exactly what we ought to be doing. And what that means is close loopholes and lower the tax rates. But Dick Armey is talking about opening up new loopholes for rich people and corporations and lowering rates for those same people. The rest of us end up paying more to pay for Armey's plan. If we did real reform means close down capital gains breaks, get rid of tax breaks for multinationals, but not Dick Armey. He says give them more breaks. When you add it all up, and Treasury's done it, we've done it, lots have, you discover that if you make $50,000, your taxes go up by $2,000 a year. If you make $200,000 or more, though, your taxes go way, way down.
The fact is that most Americans look at an IRS that is dealing with manuals that are about that thick. When they're called in when they're audited and have to review these things, it becomes such a mess that they would rather pay a little bit more and have a simpler tax structure.
We're talking $2,000 or more a year in taxes for middle-income people.
We're talking dozens, and in some cases hundreds of hours, and having people that are out there employing people in small businesses, trying to keep a tax set of
Let us simplify this system.
Well, simplify it with a flat tax.
First of all, the rates are not the complicated part. You look up your tax in a table. So we can have graduated rates in a simple system. And second, exempting capital gains doesn't simplify the system.
I want to pick up on what Bob was saying, Grover. It does seem to me that advocates of the flat tax are perhaps purposely confusing two different questions. One is tax simplification. The other is tax progressivity. You could, couldn't you, eliminate the loopholes, eliminate the deductions, lower rates for everyone, and still have a different rate for affluent people than you have for the middle class, couldn't you?
There are actually three issues here. One is how many rates do you want? Second is how broad is the base? And the third is how high is the total tax burden? I mean, one of the questions we're looking at is the present total tax burden, where the government takes between 20 and 25% of what people earn, takes it away from them and sends it to the government. There's no non-destructive, fair, equal
Yeah, but
way
that's
to do
not
that.
tax reform. Lowering
yes,
tax
lowering
cuts.
taxes is the first step to tax reform.
Let's talk mathematics now for a bit. If a new tax system is going to bring in the same amount of revenue, some people are going to pay less, somebody else has to pay more. Who pays more under the flat tax system?
If you're looking at Dick Armey's flat tax, you're looking at not simply moving to a flat tax and not looking towards revenue neutrality. He's moving to a whole series of things to reduce the total tax burden, to bring in a kind of Graham-Rudman which would squeeze spending as well as taxes.
First of all, you've got to squeeze spending by $1.4 trillion just to balance the budget, let alone adding another $200 billion a year. Let's say you could do that, which is fantasy. So under a flat tax system, who, as compared to our current system, at whatever rates you need to pay for the government, who pays more if certain people pay less, which obviously they do?
Take the individual income tax, as Armey talks about, make it more visible, have it paid monthly, not withheld from people's taxes.
Someone, if you have a flat tax as opposed to a progressive tax, someone is going to pay less, right? People who are in the higher brackets now are going to pay less. Who is going to, I just want you to say, who is going to pay more under a flat tax?
Well, there isn't a flat tax.
Let's talk about, when you can't get Grover to answer this question, who he's raising taxes on, but it's obvious. If you cut the top rate from 40 down to 17 or 25, whatever it takes, and you exempt their interest, you exempt their dividends, you exempt their capital gains, of course they're going to pay less. And that leaves the middle class and the poor. We don't exempt the poor under this Army plan. They pay more.
Look at this as part of the process of reducing the total tax on America to make the system more efficient.
See, that's where we're disagreeing, Michael.
Lowering the total tax on Americans at a time when we're trying to balance the budget is crazy. We have the lowest taxes in the world, and we still have...
Cut spending and lower taxes. They go hand in hand.
We can have a show about cutting spending. I understand that Grover wants to privatize Social Security and eliminate the police departments all over the country. That's fine. We can discuss that. But whatever money we need to raise to balance the budget,
what a wonderful debating point. What a wonderful debating point. Scare the elderly with a misrepresentation.
Are you in favor of privatizing Social Security?
Well, not by what he describes as privatization. I would certainly like to go to where people put their money into IRAs.
I just want to, so Bob is not misrepresenting.
We have the Republicans, Dick Armey included right now, proposing a whole list of a long list of new tax loopholes in their contract, right? Capital gains breaks, corporate breaks, and so forth. And then some people say, how can they be for a flat tax? The answer is very easy. It's the same loopholes, only they want to make them bigger. So you understand, this is not closing loopholes under Dick Armey. And stop saying that it is.
Do you agree whether or not Americans would see a system that is better off with a tax rate that is flat across the board, or one that has a variety of rates built into the system?
Well, that's an easy question. For most people, they're much better off with graduated rates.
Suppose you have a job and you're earning a few $1,000, $10,000, $20,000. Suppose you choose to work overtime and double your income over the year. Shouldn't you be able to expect to keep the same percentage of the second $20,000 you made as the first $20,000?
Well, we try to set the rates so that when you get people in the middle ranges, they don't get jumped into higher brackets in any substantial way by working double time, as you suggested. But when people start making these very large sums, $600,000 a year, $7 million a year, $1 billion a year in the case of some of them,
they're still going to pay 20% of that to the government.
They can afford to easily pay a lot more
and have gotten more from our society.
They're going to pay 20% of that. If 20% is fair at 50,000 or 100,000 or 200,000, why isn't it fair all the way up the line?
Because those people have gotten so much out of our society and have such a higher ability to pay taxes that they ought to pay more.
They are paying more taxes. They're paying a lot more.
They should pay a higher rate.
We're out of time. I got to cut you both. Thanks, Bob McIntyre. Thanks, Grover Norquist.
Taxes. They're complicated, cumbersome, confusing.
This is your taxes that you have to pay.
Is there a better way?
The flat tax. People like the simplicity of it.
The flat tax proposals that are out there now will increase the deficit and increase taxes on all Americans with incomes of under $200,000 a year.
Tonight, the flat tax. Is it the better way?
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Cokie Roberts.
By the time this program is over, the tax deadline will have passed for most Americans. The annual nightmare of going through the files, filling out the forms, or turning them over to an accountant will be over. But what if instead of pages and pages of numbers with 53 pages of instructions, all you had to do was fill out a postcard? Just figure out what you earned and take a percentage for the federal government. No deductions, no credits, no one tax rate for some people, another tax rate for others. Everyone pays the same percentage, no matter how much you make. It's called the flat tax, and it's fast gaining popularity in Washington.
No itemized deductions, no standard deductions, nothing. Just a family allowance. It's very generous, and the flat 17% rate.
Home interest deduction.
All of that is gone.
Charity.
All of that is gone.
Employer paid medical.
That's all gone. All the complexity, all the difficulty, and everybody says, look, I'm getting treated the same as everybody else.
Well, not everybody says that.
It turns out it raises taxes for almost everybody in the country, except for the very rich. They get gigantic cuts. Most people pay $1,500, $2,000 a year more in taxes.
Robert McIntyre heads a consumer group called Citizens for Tax Justice.
You have a flat rate that exempts interest, dividends, and capital gains. It has to be gigantic tax cuts for the high-income people. And once you've done that, who's going to make up the difference?
Dick Armey of Texas. He is the first Republican House Majority Leader since 1954, a principal architect of the contract with America. He has been called by some a one-man think tank in cowboy boots. Please welcome Congressman Dick Armey. Congressman, we're glad to have you here.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here.
Welcome back to your district as opposed to being in Washington, D.C. Right. But we have someone from Washington just to make you feel at home, and he's sitting next to you. Robert S. McIntyre directs Citizens for Tax Justice, a Washington, D.C. based coalition of labor, public interest, and citizens groups that fights for fair, progressive tax reform. Some people have called Citizens for Tax Justice the average taxpayer's voice in Washington. Please welcome to Dallas, Bob McIntyre. Dick, the plan that you have written, the Freedom and Fairness Restoration Act,
George Orwell,
has to do with a lot of things. And if we could look at graph number 1, I'm going to ask you, Dick, to look at this graph with us here. This is a breakdown of the expenses of a typical family for the year 1993, which is the latest data that we have from the Tax Foundation. And if you would sort of cover that for the viewers watching this program.
Well, the first thing you realize when you look at this graph is that the typical family pays more in taxes than it does for food, shelter, and clothing combined. Ladies and gentlemen, that's too much. And
figures are wrong, by the way.
Yeah. Bob, let me see if I can get some agreement. Do you agree that that's too much?
Well, number one, the figures are wrong. Taxes are about 30% of our gross domestic product, not 40. And the idea that that money goes into a black hole, Dick may think that Social Security is a black hole. He may think national defense is a black hole. He may think everything the government does is a black hole, but it isn't. All that money comes back to people. It helps take care of the less fortunate, protect the environment. A lot of things most of us want government to do. Mm-hmm. Should we close down some of the government? Sure.
Okay.
But you and I are going to have different lists, and then we get to the problem.
Let me ask you, the numbers that we see, the Tax Foundation obviously has those, show federal spending at 23% or so, state and local spending at the 15 to 17% level.
No, it's 30 total, so I don't know how they could possibly get to 40. We have the lowest taxes in the world. We just were inched out by Turkey. We now have the lowest taxes in the entire world. The Tax Foundation, as you know, it was taken over by one of the right-wing groups recently, and they don't put out good numbers anymore.
I did not know that. Did not know that.
And Citizens for Tax Justice puts out good numbers?
Yes, we do, as a matter of fact.
All right.
For the explosion of deficit is the growth of the federal government at the control. This is a big problem.
Dick, why did you stop that chart in 1990? Did you not want to point out that under Bill Clinton the expenditures have fallen to their lowest level as a share of the GDP since before Reagan?
No,
I didn't think you'd want to point it out, but they have. They did go up under George Bush.
That was the Office of Management and Budget's number.
Yes, but he stopped in 1990 under George Bush. They are now at their lowest level since before Reagan. I mean, it's just sort of dishonest not to give Bill Clinton credit for something, and he did cut spending.
Look, they say, in fact, I saw Alvin Rabushka on C-SPAN just the other day, and he said that in giving the deductions that you're allowing for the dependents, that you're going to have to be at a 23% rate, not a 20% rate, and not the 17% rate. How do you reconcile what the authors of that book said regarding your own tax?
Well, this is one of the things that is really up in the air. Sooner or later, as we work the process, we will have to get to an official scoring. We have talked to the Joint Tax Committee. We're trying to get their official scoring by the end of May. We've had a lot of people that have tried to score the flat tax to this point. The two most notable infamous wrong scores that have been given it to has been Citizens for Tax Justice and U.S. Treasury, both of which gave a politically motivated scoring just prior to the elections, both of which were disproven in 5 minutes.
Although exactly the same score as the authors of the book. In other words, everybody who has analyzed it seriously has come up with the same score. You know what this is like, Dennis? There was a car ad in the paper the other day. It was in one of the magazines. They repeated it. And it showed these great prices for automobiles. This is what Dick is doing. And they were really low, and there's an asterisk. And it says at the bottom, in little teeny print, add tax, tags, and $2,000. Well, that's what he's doing to you, ladies and gentlemen. He's telling you at 17% in these big exemptions, and it's bait and switch. He's going to raise your taxes. That's what he's always done before.
Let me just say, within 5 minutes of getting Bob's report, we disproved it.
They did not disprove it.
I'll say the same thing for the Treasury. The fundamental difference between the Treasury and Bob's organization is when we showed the Treasury the ways in which they were mistaken, the Treasury admitted they'd made the mistakes.
And they put out a new report giving almost exactly the same number.
Let's have a look at your tax form. Speaking of tax forms, the only one we can show on television, if we have a graphic of it here, and you see it now there on the screen, the Army Shelby flat tax form. Is this all a person would file at the end of the year and all a corporation would file?
No, not a corporation.
No, a corporation would have a longer form than that. It would be less than the form it has. No, I'll go on.
Well, Dick, could you explain how it would differ from now?
It is simpler then. It is a more complex form, but that is the nature. All business bookkeeping processes are more complex than those of a home.
Of course.
That is not something
the
for us to shudder at.
The idea is that the code would be significantly less, the paperwork would be significantly less.
His business tax, which is 95% of the tax code, is business taxes. His business tax is identical to the current business tax.
How are we going?
There's no difference. Dick, can you explain one difference?
I see your point. 95% of the tax code.
It's business. You know that. It's not taxing wages, for goodness sakes.
I have a question for you, Bob. It seems to me that throughout this process, you have been defending the behemoth of the socialist state that we have today. I don't know why you want to continue to defend the socialist welfare state when the last election proved that the American people don't want it anymore.
Bob, please. But before I let you answer that, only thing I can say is welcome to Texas.
Well, you know, it's been suggested that maybe people who don't support that so-called big government should just take a pass on all the things it hands out, and maybe we can work that out. No Social Security, no roads, no national defense. If we're attacked, you're out. Now listen, folks, a lot of people like to think that the government spends all of its money on foreign aid and poor people. It doesn't. It spends most of its money on interest on the debt that these guys built up, defense, and Social Security.
back. And when we abolish the income tax from the books as an insurance policy, I would not at all mind seeing the repeal of the 16th Amendment. To make doubly sure that the income tax won't rise from the dead and ever again haunt the American people.
Is a national sales tax. Why?
Well, you know, you've heard all this talk these days about sales taxes, flat taxes, various consumption taxes, and they all add up, really, to pretty much the same thing. Huge tax increases on most people, and big tax cuts for very rich people. That's what they're all about, and that's why I think they're a bad idea.
McIntyre is executive director of Citizens for Tax Justice.
The people that are promoting this are basically frauds. They're out there saying they can have a 17% rate, gigantic exemptions, and still raise enough money. Everyone knows that's not true. They know it's not true.
Clearly, a new CR should be passed while these very difficult negotiations go on, and to shut down the government would be simply foolish.
Of the Democrats possibly bringing pressure on Newt Gingrich to cut down the $245 billion tax cut that basically benefits the rich. I don't know.
Well, it's sort of the traditional approach to the budget. They get into a crunch at the end of the year and have to deal with it. And they've got a lot of things they have to do. They have to cut Medicare and Medicaid by more than some people would like, including some Republicans. They have to shoehorn a tax cut that's too big to fit into their budget, which means they've been scaling back the tax breaks for the middle class and keeping the ones for the corporations and the rich. They have a lot to do. When it does get finally passed, and I'm sure it will, the president will probably veto it, and then we'll see another 2 months of work where they try to make something that's acceptable to both sides.
Now, is there anything in that process that you think ought to be changed significantly?
Well, you know, the process is a deliberative one, that they let the members of Congress get their 2 cents in, and then at the end this year, Newt Gingrich just said he's going to do what he wants to do. I suppose I'd like the process to have less Newt in it.
On a so-called flat tax.
Robert McNamara is the director of Citizens for Tax Justice, and Peter Ferrara is the general counsel of Americans for Tax Reform.
It's Robert McIntyre.
Yeah.
You said McNamara.
Oh, I did? Robert, I'm so sorry.
It is fair. It's equal treatment for everybody.
Well, if you cut the taxes, Peter, on people that make 10 times as much as you do, then you have to pay more to make up the difference.
No, we're not going to
That's
make up,
mathematics.
we're going to cut spending to make up the difference.
Oh,
that was
tell
the
me
point.
where your
and we're
spending
going to cut spending on
okay, guys.
across the board.
We have run out of time.
Well.
We have heard the first of many debates on flat tax. We thank you both, Robert McIntyre and Peter Ferrara, for joining us.
You say flatter would be fairer. Why?
Well, it's fair because, first of all, everybody pays the same rate. It's equal treatment for all. That means if you earn 10 times what I do, you pay 10 times the tax that I do. Not 20 times or not 0 because you have a lot of special interest loopholes. The loopholes are closed. Everyone pays the same rate. All income is taxed. It's taxed once. That's the essence of fairness. That's why it's a fair tax.
All right, Bob McIntyre, your answer is sort of a general no to this flat tax idea.
No, no, and no again. I mean, what we're looking at here is a proposal to let the rich off and tax the middle class much more heavily than they're taxed now.
Fewer have more, and there's a scheme here for them to pay less for the persons or corporations. And do you think you really can sell that? It seems that, the wealthy get NAFTA and a stimulus for cheap labor. And of course, they're now getting bonuses for laying off workers. Now they want less taxes. And for less taxes, we'll get an economic growth. It's hard to sell.
Well, I don't think so. First of all, we embraced some new ideas. Why not, let's trick wealthy people into investing in the economy instead of investing in loopholes?
Man, you guys are too smart to be tricked.
When people discover that what it really means is more loopholes and lower taxes for the rich and higher taxes for the middle class, people will drop it like a hot potato because people do not want to pay more so that Steve Forbes can get a big tax cut.
Arguing that the current tax system is simply too cumbersome and way too wasteful, they proposed instead a retail sales tax of about 15%. That's it. Nada. No more.
Well, it's kind of amazing. You don't know whether to laugh or cry. I guess this is the dumb idea of the week, but these folks have gotten together and said they can have a 15% sales tax, and there's dozens of things wrong, but let's just tick off 3. Number 1, you couldn't come close to replacing the current income taxes at a 15% sales tax rate. The rate would have to be somewhere closer to 30%, maybe more, depending on whether you tax things like health care and religious services and so forth. Second problem, it's grotesquely unfair. They zap the middle class and the poor, and they let the rich alone. That's the problem with any kind of sales tax.
But the rich buy too, don't they?
Yeah, but they certainly don't spend as high a share of their income as ordinary people. And
who cares if they're buying a lot of expensive yachts and what have you? I mean...
Well, think about it this way. We have a progressive income tax. If you replace that system with a regressive sales tax, obviously you've cut taxes on the rich and you have to raise them on the middle class to make it up. The final problem with it, not the final, but the third, is look, they're not eliminating the IRS. They say they're going to replace income taxes. Well, that's not all the IRS collects. It collects payroll taxes for starters, and every business in the country, every small business in particular, will still have to compute its income to figure out how much it owes in Social Security taxes. So they haven't simplified things. They've made the system grotesquely unfair, and they're going to have a rate that's so high the underground economy will go through the roof.
I think your strongest point is having to raise the rate. Let's put that aside for one moment, though. It seems that if you tax consumption, what you do is encourage savings, and then even the poorest person, if they choose to save their money rather than spend it, is going to have an inducement, an incentive to save that in the long run is beneficial for everyone.
Well, you can't say that about the poor. We don't tax them at all under the income tax.
Well, so let's say the middle-class person.
Okay, let's take the middle-class person. Do you think middle-class people will save more if their taxes go up by $2,000 a year as they would under this kind of plan? Of course not.
But don't they have a choice between consumption and savings on some level?
Yeah, they cannot eat, they cannot drive to work,
come on,
they cannot wear clothes.
A lot of people buy VCRs and buy an extra pair of tennis shoes. Maybe they'll stick that in the bank.
They won't have that money to stick in the bank because this raises their taxes so much. You know, this is a theory that was tried out many times before, but most recently in the early 1980s, and when the savings rate went through the floor, even President Reagan figured out that trying to use the tax code to bribe people to save just doesn't work.
Why are you so sure of that?
Why am I so sure? Because I've been around long enough to see it tried over and over again. From Gingrich, Kemp, etc., is they think that the problem with America is that average people pay too little in taxes and that rich people pay too much. And they want to fix it. They want to raise taxes on most Americans, and while they're at it, cut back on the services government provides. And they want to do that for one reason and one reason only. They want to cut taxes for the richest people in the country. It's a very crazy sounding program. Worse than that, it's one that's been tried out and was what gave us the giant deficits of the 80s. Lately, you know, we've seen the deficit come down by 2/3, and Republicans have said, well, Clinton shouldn't get credit for that. It's from economic growth. And then at the same time, they say that we need a big tax cut because the economy's not doing well enough. They don't have anything to say other than partisan rhetoric. In fact, the economy is doing pretty well. The deficit is down, and we need to stick with that. The last thing we need is another big boost in the budget deficit, which is what this Kemp-Gingrich stuff is all about.
What we're hearing, unfortunately, is a continuation of the class envy, class warfare kind of rhetoric we've heard for so long. Look, the Cold War is over. Democratic cast, and what 20 years ago was the vanguard of the socialist collectivist view of the world has now unfortunately become the rearguard action, and that's what we're hearing with the rhetoric about envy and class warfare. We're looking for a way to spur the economy so that everybody can benefit as we enter the new century.
Here's how the Baltimore Sun characterizes the debate now going on within the Republican Party. You can see the caricature of tax cut and Bob Dole looking rather shocked here, saying, I am married to deficit reduction. I am married to, I am too old for this.
I think we should have an agreement that we should lower the level of rhetoric and the tone, and it's much more productive if we sit here and have a civil conversation. We don't accuse each other of trying to take food out of the mouths of babies and these constant characterizations of extremists, and that's just not productive.
Well, unfortunately, you're engaged in a cover-up. That's why somebody has to use some rhetoric to explain what it is you're doing. You come out for a plan that has a flat rate of 17 or 20%. You know that it adds $200 billion to the deficit. You say, no, it doesn't. Then somebody says, well, where are you going to get the spending cuts? You say, well, we won't have to have any. And then somebody says, well, you know, this cuts taxes for the richest people by, you know, $50,000, $60,000 a year. And you say, oh, no, it doesn't do that. So those are all truths that you deny, and then you accuse me of high rhetoric? My goodness.
Mr. McIntyre, you know, I call guys like you e-communists. I defy you to tell me where Newt Gingrich and all of the Republicans have gone and said, well, the middle class is not paying enough taxes. Sir, you are lying through your teeth.
That's not true. As a matter of fact, Dick Armey, who's the majority leader, has proposed what is a 20% flat tax. Everyone who has looked at that has found, everyone, including Army's people as far as I can tell,
who's looked at it, has concluded that it would raise taxes on all but the very best off Americans.
The capital gains tax is an unconscionable tax on productive effort.
As opposed to the wage tax,
and,
right.
It's a perfect example also of how punitive government taxes are self-defeating. If we raise capital gains taxes. And we were told then that capital gains revenues would increase dramatically. Of course, what happened? Capital gains realizations, the sales of assets, plummeted.
That's not true.
And they have fallen ever since.
That's just made up. And
capital gains realizations today are lower than CBO and the Joint Tax Committee estimated they would be by orders of magnitude.
Not true.
Well,
in fact, the guy who did the estimates for the Joint Tax Committee happens to work for me now. And if you'd like to speak with him, he'll explain to you that, in fact, capital gains have done a lot better than they predicted.
Republicans pushed a constitutional amendment requiring a 2/3 vote to raise taxes. It lost, big time. In Boston, 2 congressmen reenacted the Boston Tea Party by dumping the entire federal tax code in Boston Harbor and calling for a national sales tax. And you can bet that somewhere out there in America tonight, Steve Forbes is still selling a flat tax. Sales tax, no tax, that's our crossfire tonight. Pat?
Robert McIntyre, look, why not move to a simple flat system, whether it's a sales tax or a flat tax that cuts in at a certain level, simplify the system, save all that time and energy?
Great idea. Let's simplify the tax code. Let's get rid of the special tax breaks. Let's make it so you fill out what you made and you pay tax on it at a fair rate. I agree. I'm with you 100% on that, Pat, but one thing. Graduated rates have nothing to do with what you and I are talking about, because you can look up your tax on a graduated schedule just as easy as you can multiply your taxable income by 25.7%. So the rates aren't the problem. The issue is we have too many special breaks in the tax code, and I'm with you. Let's get rid of them. Let's tax capital gains and wages and interest and dividends and everything else people make the same. You know, if you make a lot...
flat tax rate?
Not the same rate. If you make a lot of money, you should pay at a higher rate, but that doesn't make it complicated.
Look, Robert, here's the point. If you make... Why not, look, first you cut out, say, the people who make the first $20,000, but above that, why don't you have a flat tax?
If you go to a flat tax, and this is just simple arithmetic, you're going to be cutting taxes at the top because you're lowering the rates so much. You have to raise them on everybody else to break even. I mean, that's just arithmetic. We can't repeal the laws of arithmetic no matter how much we'd like to. But simplification, Pat, I'm with you.
Hey, Pete DuPont, as a native son of Delaware, I want to salute a former governor of Delaware. Thanks for being with us. And my question to you, Pete DuPont, first of all, is with this flat tax, I wonder why is it that the main people pushing a flat tax in this country are named Forbes and DuPont? Doesn't that tell you something about who really benefits from this thing? And Steve Forbes and other Americans who are wealthy Americans making $500,000 and up, you're the ones who are going to get the big tax breaks under a flat tax, and the middle class is going to get socked again.
Not so. For all the things, the complaints that Bob is making about the loopholes, he just wants to add to the loopholes and change their shape. I want to get rid of them.
Well, you know, the plan, this flat tax plan, it's kind of a funny plan. It exempts interest, dividends, and capital gains and corporate profits. It's not, I mean, it's like a loophole consolidation plan. Why do they want to always cut the income tax on the rich? They don't say, well, let's lower the payroll tax on working people. Never say that.
Oh, that ought to be done as well. And furthermore, the Social Security system ought to be privatized.
Do you think we're undertaxed? Should we raise taxes?
Some people are undertaxed. The average American isn't.
Nobody.
The average American is paying as much as they ever did. No. The big problem is they're not getting much from government. And you know why they're not? Because 26 cents on the income tax dollar goes to pay interest on the debt. And that's what we did in the 1980s, and it was a big mistake.
The emotional battle on the House floor, a reminder of the dramatically differing opinions on tax cuts. Here to continue debating that hot topic for us is Chris Edwards, Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, and Bob McIntyre, Director of Citizens for Tax Justice.
What Congress has passed today is not radical at all. The President's Tax Commission proposed a full elimination of the double tax on dividends This just drops the rate to 15%. What we've got here is a sensible, incremental reform.
Sensible. Mr. McIntyre, do you agree?
Absolutely not. I mean, you know, the Senate started off this year with a similar revenue target to the House in terms of tax cuts. And then after the hurricanes, the war in Iraq continuing, and all the other problems we faced, they concluded we couldn't afford it. And they scaled it way back and included basically just alternative minimum tax relief for 1 year. What the House has done is adopt the Senate's alternative minimum tax plan and add another $85 billion to it over the next 10 years, and we can't afford it. We're funding a quarter of our regular government programs on borrowed money right now, and you can't sustain that.
What about the argument, Mr. McIntyre, that the tax cuts, in fact, is the reason that this economy did turn around?
Well, we're talking specifically about these capital gains and dividend cuts, and they didn't do any good. The stock market has been flat for the last 2 years, as everybody with an investment portfolio knows. Let me just point out to you that under Bill Clinton, the stock market doubled. And under George W. Bush, so far, it's up by 5%, which is less than the rate of inflation.
Well, let's talk about the ramifications of this, Mr. Edwards. Isn't it true that at some point, the fact that we continue to borrow and we are looking at twin deficits, at some point, the growth just stops? It just doesn't add up?
No, I think the deficit is a real problem. It's really immoral, frankly, that we're pushing all this debt onto the next generation of young workers. But this tax cut that was passed in the House today, $50 billion over 5 years, only $10 billion a year in a $2.6 trillion budget. It was a tiny drop in the bucket compared to how much spending has been increasing over the years.
Mr. McIntyre?
Well, I mean, look, you add up all the tax cuts that have been passed so far, and they cost about $2.5 trillion counting into interest over a decade. That's the reason we're running gigantic budget deficits, and we need to stop doing it. And at least the U.S. Senate has showed some sense here. Let's hope that the crazy, reckless people in the House will get their comeuppance this time, and the Senate will insist on some sense of responsibility on the fiscal side.
All right. The New York Sun called it Laffer's victory. That is to say, lower tax rates, rising revenues, stronger economy, and lower budget deficits. And we have the great Laffer himself here, but we also have Bob McIntyre, who remains to be converted and is somewhat cynical about the whole issue. He's a director of Citizens for Tax Justice. Welcome, gentlemen. I tell you what, Mr. McIntyre, we want to give you total equal time. Why don't you tell us where your skepticism is of the clear Laffer effect on the shrinking budget deficit?
Well, first of all, let's look at where the budget deficit is. Last year, it was about $500 billion, counting what we borrowed, diverted from Social Security. This year, the administration says it's going to be $470 billion. Not much different. What about revenues? Well, personal income taxes are doing better than last year, but they're still a quarter below the share of the economy that they were when Bush came in. That's a huge drop. Corporate tax revenues have seen a surge, but nowhere near as much as corporate profits. And in fact, if you look at the only other 3 years in the last 60 that corporate profits were this high, revenues were 65% more. So here we are, another $500 billion deficit year after 4 or 5 years of decent economic performance, but not great. After all, you look, job growth has not been good. Wage growth has been non-existent for most people. The only thing that's done well is corporate profits. So you can't say that these things boosted the economy. All you can say is that they've been $3 trillion and running in new debt, and we're going to have to pay for that, which is why 99% of the American public are worse off when you net their tax cuts against this increased debt.
99% worse off. All right, what's your response?
Oh, my goodness. I should go shoot myself or something, Larry. I mean, it's amazing how you can get good news coming out like this today, which we should all be rejoicing in. And it is clearly a consequence of the lower tax rates.
Our problem is, and Art thinks it's not a problem, is that here we are with a reasonably good economy running a $500 billion deficit. And we're doing it every year, and we have to stop.
But
that's what makes us unhappy.
Coming. Art Laffer, take us out. There's a lot of new gloom on Wall Street. Economy's slowing down. Profits are slowing down. Do you have some great investment advice for our viewers, Art?
I think the markets are poised for an enormous expansion, Larry.
When the 110th Congress convenes January 4th, One of the key topics of discussion will be taxes, specifically the alternative minimum tax. Many Democrats and some Republicans want to reform or repeal the AMT, but as Washington Bureau Chief Darren Gersh explains, doing that will be difficult, hampered by the twists and turns of a very complicated tax.
AMT twist number one. When it comes to the alternative minimum tax, Democrats are complaining loudest because the AMT hits voters in high-tax blue states hardest. But tax analyst Leonard Berman figures scrapping the AMT would mostly benefit those making between $200,000 and $500,000 a year. In other words, the top 5% or so of taxpayers.
Well, I guess it shows that Democrats don't hate rich people.
The AMT was also created to make sure people making $1 million or more pay income taxes. But because of the way the AMT is structured, people making less than that might pay a higher tax rate.
It's not a flat tax, it's a camel-shaped tax. I mean, it goes 26%, 32.5%, 35%, and then back down to 28%. And those people in that pump part in the middle who are subject to that 35% rate, they're all on the AMT.
A second AMT twist, says analyst Alan Viard, is that it takes away about a third of the regular income tax cuts the president has signed into law.
So unless it eventually is corrected, it does take away part of his legacy, yes.
Given all this, you would think AMT repeal would be a slam dunk for Democrats and Republicans. The political twist is this. In theory, 30 million middle-class taxpayers could end up paying the AMT in a few years. But right now, only 4 million taxpayers pay it.
The AMT doesn't look like a relevant issue yet. It's somebody else's tax. And so if I were to come to them as a member of Congress or as the president and say, I got rid of the AMT, you're not going to have to pay it, people would say, well, gosh, I never have paid it.
And repealing it would require raising other taxes, which is what activist Robert McIntyre wants to do. He suggests Democrats raise the top rate on capital gains and dividends under the AMT.
And the upshot would be that the AMT would go from being paid 20% of it by the best off 1% to 2/3 of it being paid by the top 1%, which is what it was supposed to be all along.
The final AMT twist is the cost. Repealing it would cut Uncle Sam's tax take over the next decade by more than $1 trillion. Darren Gersh, Nightly Business Report, Washington.
Now, there's one huge area of agreement among Republicans and Democrats, the U.S. tax code. Well, it's 5,100 pages, and they all agree it's out of control. The alternative minimum tax is just one example of the insanity here. So is the flat tax, a single tax rate for everyone, and maybe one sheet of paper, the best way to bring fairness and simplicity to a system that is neither fair nor simple? John Bertu is president of the National Taxpayers Union and favors the flat tax. Bob McIntyre, director of the Citizens for Tax Justice, opposes said tax. All right, John, let's begin with you. A flat tax. Explain just in a couple of sentences the most compelling reason to adopt it.
Higher economic growth, simplicity. You mentioned the enormous number of pages, 5,100 pages in our tax code. Americans are spending 6 to 7 billion hours this year filling out their taxes, and it's costing, the current system is costing the economy hundreds of billions of dollars. We can do much, much better. A flat tax is a great solution.
John, before I get Robert's rebuttal here, do you exempt people below a certain income level from paying it at all to retain a certain level of progressivity here?
We do. I mean, it's not as progressive as the current system, as Bob will point out, but it retains progressivity under, for example, the Forbes flat tax. There's large personal and family exemptions. I think the first $42,000 of income for a family of 4 is exempt. So again, it's not as progressive as the current tax system, but there is still an element of progressivity here.
Robert, it's pretty compelling. I mean, even when you add together that you've got 6 or 7 billion hours being spent by Americans, I mean, there's a lot of productivity and time being lost in the current system.
Well, if you look at what's wrong with our current tax code, there's plenty. I mean, it's way too complicated. It doesn't raise enough money to pay for the government, so we run big budget deficits. And there's way too many loopholes for big corporations and wealthy people to get away with murder. We need to fix those things, absolutely. But the flat tax moves us in exactly the wrong direction. You remember, the flat tax only taxes people on their wages. So the rich people with their capital gains and dividends and so forth, they don't pay tax on that, and then they get a much lower tax rate. So they make out like bandits. Well,
Where does the money come from then? It comes from middle and low income
John,
people.
that's an interesting point. So what would you say to a so-called flat tax that was on all income, whether it came from wages or from capital gains?
Well, I mean, what we're saying, all we're doing under a flat tax is we're not taxing it twice as we currently are. We're taxing it once. Under a flat tax, you
well,
tax
on the
it
dividend,
at,
but what about the capital gain?
Well, you just tax it at the corporate level, and we're not going to tax it twice.
All right, Robert, what do you think about that? I mean, exempt dividends from it.
Well, here's the bottom line for the flat tax.
Mm-hmm.
They want to raise taxes on middle income people and cut taxes on wealthy people. And if middle America wants that, well, then vote for the flat tax. But it's going to mean a large tax increase, not trivial, thousands of dollars a year more for the typical middle income family and hundreds of thousands of dollars less for very wealthy people.
Robert, they're saying, though, a flat tax of 19%. Does the average middle American family pay less than 19% of their wage income right now?
Well, look at it this way. Under the current law, a family of 4 with 2 children pays no tax at all up to $42,000.
Which would be retained.
In fact, they get a negative tax below that, so they get tax credits that a check from the Treasury.
Mm-hmm.
Above that, until you make about $100,000, your tax rate is 15%, less than the flat tax rate, even the 19% that's proposed, which is not enough to pay for the government. So all those people have to pay much more, from $0 all the way up to $100,000. Now, if you make $1 million and it's all capital gains, your tax under the flat tax is 0. Now, that's a disaster.
Washington has its eye on private equity income as a possible new source of revenue. That income is currently taxed at the capital gains rate of 15%. Congress wants to tax it as ordinary income at 35%. So should private equity income be taxed as capital gains or as ordinary income? Joining me now, Robert McIntyre, Director of Citizens for Tax Justice, and Gregory Markle, Partner and Chairman of the Litigation Department at Collider, Wickersham and Taft. Nice to have you here, gentlemen. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Mr. McIntyre, let me start with you. Why change the tax rate?
Well, what we need to do here is make the tax rate that should apply. These investment funds are being run by managers who are being paid for their financial expertise, and that's earned income that ought to be taxed at the regular tax rates and be subject also to the payroll taxes. Mm-hmm. Instead, they're claiming that for tax purposes only, they should be treated as earning capital gains and pay a 15% rate or sometimes even less than that. And it just doesn't make any sense. Why should corporate executives have to pay the regular rate? Ordinary working people have to pay the regular rates. Why are these guys being allowed to exploit an inadvertent loophole in the partnership laws and say, hey, even though we admit this is earned income, for tax purposes, we should pay it at a remarkably low rate? It's just not fair to everyone else. And, they have so much money, they can afford to pay a little bit more in taxes.
Mr. Markle, what do you think?
Well, I disagree with everything he said. First of all, the history here is completely wrong. There's nothing inconsistent with current tax law with the way the tax laws are being treated by the private equity funds and the hedge funds. Most of the managers are paying ordinary income on the base fee, and only on their investments, which they may or may not realize in the future, do they have a capital gain interest. So first of all, it's just wrong. Second...
Well, let me just point out...
Let him finish second, and then we'll go back to you, Mr. McIntyre. Go ahead,
okay.
Mr. Markle.
Second, the hedge funds perform a tremendous service for this country. The hedge funds are one of the most successful areas in the financial area. The financial area is one of the places where the United States is competitive. And providing these incentives, which are these carries, incent the managers to do well in their investments, number one, and number two, it aligns their interests with their investors.
Okay. Mr. McIntyre, what about that?
Well, let me just point out that Blackstone Group is in the middle of an IPO right now. And as part of that, they have put out documents with the Securities and Exchange Commission which state explicitly that to get around the Investment Act of 1940, they want to make it very clear that they are not engaged in investing. They are engaged in providing financial management services. That's the story they're telling the Securities and Exchange Commission. They just want to be able to tell a different, inconsistent story to the Internal Revenue Service. While they were right in the IPO statement, they're wrong with the Internal Revenue Service, and the loophole should be closed.
Mr. McIntyre, what about those who claim, though, that as Mr. Merkel pointed out in his opinion, that the hedge fund and the private equities dealers of the world create an awful lot of wealth for this country that trickles down and creates jobs?
They don't create anything. They move money around. They acquire companies, lay off workers, lower wages, and then go public again with these same companies, but they're not in as good shape as they were before.
Welcome back. As we await the pricing of the Blackstone IPO, the world of power and money is in the crosshairs of Congress. As we have been reporting, Representative Henry Waxman is asking the Securities and Exchange Commission to block the IPO. He's saying slow it down until after Congress conducts hearings on the industry and Blackstone. Plus, the New York Times reports lawmakers are considering a new and more far-reaching proposal to end tax breaks for private equity firms and hedge funds. My next guests disagree on whether these plans are on the right track. Joining me now to talk about it is Robert McIntyre, Director of Citizens for Tax Justice, along with Nicole Deese, attorney at Schutz & Bowen. Nice to have you with us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Let's begin on this idea that the IPO should be slowed down. Robert McIntyre, where do you stand on that?
I'd say this, that whatever happens with the IPO, Blackstone should be on notice that it's not going to be able to use its tax shelter anymore, even if it goes forward now.
All right, well, let's talk about the taxation, though, of private equity. This is an issue that certainly has been gaining momentum for some time now. Carried interest is something that everyone is focused on here. Do you look at carried interest more like wages and salaries, or is it like investment? Nicole?
It's an investment. These managers are being paid based on their performance. The more value that they create of these companies, the more that they're paid.
So you're calling it capital gains, and you're saying that that should be taxed at 15% versus 35%. Do you agree, sir?
Absolutely not. In fact, Blackstone doesn't agree. In its SEC filings for the IPO, they make a big deal about the fact that they are not an investment company, that they are, in fact, fee for services, for management advice, for financial advice, that it's all earned income, and that's the way it ought to be treated for taxes. They just want to have it one way for SEC purposes and another way for Internal Revenue Code purposes. They're right with the SEC, and that's the way it should be treated.
What's your gut? You think this is going to be this will pass and become law?
I think in some form it probably will. I don't think it's going to be. I don't think you're going to get the 35% ordinary tax rate, but I think in some form an increase will happen.
Robert?
Oh, I think it's going to pass, and you can see it around the world. The British are debating the same thing. The Germans, I spoke to one of their ministers today, and they're debating the same thing. So it's all over the world. People are waking up to the fact that these guys are making hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and they're paying taxes as if they were making $20,000.
All right, we'll leave it there. Good to have you with us. Thanks so much for weighing in on this important topic. We so appreciate it. Welcome back. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson is calling for reform of the U.S. corporate tax structure. In an op-ed piece in Thursday's Wall Street Journal, Paulson said cutting corporate and capital gains taxes will spur spending and boost productivity. But it is the key to keeping America great? Well, that is the question. Ryan Ellis of Americans for Tax Reform says yes. But Robert McIntyre, Director for Citizens for Tax Justice, thinks Paulson's plan goes off track. Nice to have you with us, gentlemen. Welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
Mr. McIntyre, let me kick it off with you. What's wrong with Paulson's plan?
Well, you know, it's a little confusing what he says in the Wall Street Journal piece. He starts off saying he wants to take us back to what Ronald Reagan and the Congress did in 1986 with the Tax Reform Act. And in that bill, they closed hundreds of corporate loopholes, set the corporate rate at 34%, and had a big increase in corporate taxes. They also raised taxes on investors. And according to Paulson, that led to a 20-year economic boom. If that's what he wants to do, I'm for it. But I'm afraid, looking at what the Bush administration has done so far, that that's not what he wants to do, and he has a different plan. But at least the first half of his article, broaden the corporate tax base, raise corporate taxes so we're not the lowest in the world, that would be excellent.
Ryan Ellis, what do you think?
Well, Maria, this really all proceeds from the fact that we have the second highest corporate income tax rate in the industrialized world, behind only Japan.
Robert McIntyre, what do you say to that?
Well, you know, we do have a corporate nominal rate that's a bit higher than Europe, but We don't tax most of their profit. In fact, the last study we did, the companies on average managed to tell the IRS they only made half as much as they told their shareholders they made. So if we can get that up so they report their income honestly, sure, we can have a little bit lower rate. We can also do something to deal with our massive budget deficit problem.
We got our callers, if you will, our insiders, and then Robert McIntyre works for an institution called Citizens for Tax Justice. Mr. McIntyre, as our guest, we welcome you to the program, and you get the chance to speak first. There is a significant argument that's about to ensue in this town over the next 6 months on what tax rates ought to be, specifically on the corporate level. Walk us through your particular agenda.
Well, the Treasury Department put out a report in conjunction with this effort, and it really gets an A in terms of analyzing the problem. I mean, first of all, they point out that our corporate tax rate is quite similar to that in our major trading partners, the G7, 39 versus 36. So the propaganda that we're way out of line, they dispute that. And secondly, and more importantly, they point out that our real corporate tax rate is much below our trading partners because of all the loopholes we have in the tax law for the corporations. In fact, they totaled them up at $1.2 trillion for these loopholes in cost.
Right. And to that end, and everything you say is absolutely true, but at the same time, we also have the highest, or we're virtually tied with Japan, for the highest corporate tax rate in the world. Why not make more of an effort to try to get that number down?
Well, see, that's the issue here is two. One, our corporate rate isn't that far out of line, but our real rate is much below it because we have all these tax breaks. And as Treasury points out, these are hurting our economy, not helping us because they're distorting capital investment. So what we need to do, as they almost point out, is broaden the corporate tax base so we tax companies on what they really make. Then the question is, what do you do with all the money that you raise from that? Right. And that's what the real argument's about.
Well, Bob, it's John Harwood. If you could broaden the base, take away some of the deductions across the board, would you think that lowering the overall rate would be in line?
Well, you might be able to lower it a point or two, but as Alan Greenspan pointed out yesterday, and I'm not a big fan of his, but he was right on this, the government faces huge fiscal problems in the future, particularly as the baby boomers retire and the government has to start paying back Social Security, all the money it's borrowed from it. So any place that you can get money that doesn't hurt the economy, but in fact helps it by getting capital investment going where the market wants it to go rather than where the government wants it to go, well, that seems to me to be a twofer, and we could deal with our fiscal problems and make ourselves more competitive by broadening the corporate tax base.
If you're tired of paying what you think are high taxes, in today's Wall Street Journal, Jerry Seib saying watch for tax-cutting agendas to hit the presidential campaign trail as things heat up. Not only on the Republican platform, by the way, but from the Democrats, too. Are more tax cuts what we need? We ask a couple of folks with a very strong point of view in both directions. Grover Norquist, president of Americans for Tax Reform. Robert McIntyre, director of Citizens for Tax Justice. Now, I just love the names of these firms. I love the names. Grover, I'll begin with you. I presume you've not met a tax cut you didn't like, right?
I can't think of one.
Yeah. So walk us through, and let's talk about the least probable. In other words, why would a Democrat be advocating tax cuts, as Jerry suggests they might come January?
Well, because even the Democrats have to pay some attention to what's happening internationally. The American corporate tax rate, corporate income tax rate's 35%, add 4% an average of state taxes, 39%. The European average is 25%. How do we compete with Europe with their average tax rate at the corporate level of 25%?
And the only thing is, Grover, and I know that you know this very well, there are $1 billion and one write-offs and loopholes, and so while that number makes a great headline and you can debate it, the effective tax rate, as you know, is substantially lower than that, but that's almost beside the point.
They got loopholes in Europe.
Fair enough.
And we're competing with places like Ireland with a 12.5% tax rate.
So are you suggesting Ireland is going to displace America as the economic force on the planet as a result of their tax policy?
No, but no companies are moving from Ireland here, and some are moving the other way.
Fair enough. Now, on the other hand, Robert, have you ever met a tax cut you did like?
Well, sure.
Name one.
Well, for instance, when Bill Clinton cut taxes on low-income families in 1993, that was a very good thing. When John Kennedy cut taxes, when the top tax rate was way too high, it was 90%, and he cut it to 70%, that was a good thing.
That was 50 years ago.
Well,
I mean, let's,
I haven't seen one of Grover's tax cuts that I like, I'll tell you that.
Say again?
I haven't seen one of Grover's style tax cuts I like, because he always wants to give the money to the people who already have more than they need. And that's
not stealing somebody's money is not giving them the money.
I see, Grover. Well, you are stealing it, because you and your pals on Capitol Hill have added $3 trillion to the national debt that my kids and your kids are going to have to pay for. That's stealing it from them, and you're giving it to people who make millions of dollars a year.
I oppose that
Grover,
spending.
hold on. Yeah, and I don't want to get into a policy conversation. This is not a political network. It's a money network, and so that's why I try to focus the conversation on how tax policy can be utilized to stimulate the economy. Grover, walk us through how you believe your particular version of tax cutting is the most economically beneficial.
Well, there are a couple of very good proposals that have been put on the table. Expanding expensing to all business investment. Fred Thompson started moving in that direction. Very helpful in terms of stimulating the economy. Reducing marginal tax rates to no higher than 25% would strongly help the economy. And indexing the basis for capital gains is something that some of us believe the president could do by executive order.
All right. And now to you, Robert, same question. You want tax cuts for the middle and lower income portions of the economy. How do you believe that ultimately is most stimulative to GDP, basically?
Well, I mean, if you get consumer spending moving, that's what drives the economy. It's most of the economy. But right now, we've got an incredibly stimulative policy. We're funding a quarter of our non-Social Security spending with borrowed money. And we've got to stop doing it. I mean, you've got Fred Thompson, who Grover mentioned, who says he wants to pay for his tax cut plan by cutting Social Security benefits. I mean, that's not a good idea. And I hope Fred Thompson keeps saying it, because people will understand what the Grover and the others' agenda really is.
Let me tell you what is probably going to go up. Your sales tax. And the Democrats are now talking about this. So this is everything from the stuff you buy in the food store, your eggs, your apples, your loaf of bread, your pound of meat, your iPod, computer, you name it, anything and everything may be subject to a brand new federal tax. Now, this was once, of course, unthinkable. Nobody wanted to talk about it, but it's becoming very thinkable now, because we're facing a nearly $4 trillion deficit over the next 5 years. Now, we got a top Democrat saying that a national sales tax could be, maybe should be, on the table. Estimates reportedly ranging from a 10% to a 25% sales tax. Now, the Obama administration is calling it unlikely, but it's not ruling it out completely, and quite frankly, it can't, because eventually we have to pay for this deficit. Bob McIntyre from Citizens for Tax Justice says no to the VAT tax. That's a value-added tax, which is somewhat like your sales tax, but yes to taxing companies and the rich. And then we have Alan Viard says that a VAT tax actually is inevitable, from the American Enterprise Institute scholar, and he joins us by phone. All right, so let's start with this notion of a value-added tax. And basically, so people understand, the product is taxed as it's made. So first it's taxed at the wholesale level, then you get a little bit more tax when it gets to the distributor, a little bit more tax when it gets out there, and that's your value-added tax. All has to be returned. So, Alan, let's start with you. You think this is a good idea?
Well, I think it's going to happen, and I think that it would be better to have a value-added tax replacing part of the income tax, rather than simply trying to rely only on income taxation. Income taxation is very destructive economically as rates become high, and because of the disincentive to saving and investment that it imposes. A value-added tax allows that problem to be avoided.
Mind if I jump here real quick? Let me ask you this. So, Europe has value-added taxes. It runs around a 21% tax on just about everything you do. If you buy a house, that means you've paid a tax on the windows, the glass, the doors, everything. We're emulating an economy that's frankly been stagnant, wrought with chronic unemployment, and it bleeds the consumer dry by this value-added tax. Why would we do something like this?
Because an income tax is even more destructive. I mean, the European countries have very large government sectors, and that's a mistake that they've made. Hopefully, we will be able to keep our government sector from getting as big as theirs. Although to do that, we're going to have to start getting serious about restraining the growth of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Just imagine the economic harm that would occur if the European countries were trying to sustain those public sectors using income taxation. The burdens on saving and investment would be enormous.
Alan, let me bring it over to Bob and get him involved here. Bob, you know, the biggest issue I've got with all of the taxes, look, I didn't want any of these bailouts, but now I know they got to be paid for. I want a fair tax. I'm sick to death of these targeted tax tricks, and that's what I'm worried about, a national sales tax or a VAT tax or whatever. I know that the Republican and Democrats in power are going to use it to basically target their biggest donors and constituents, et cetera, et cetera. Walk me through what my biggest fear, would you?
Well, you're right that a value-added tax is just as susceptible to special interest tax breaks as the income tax, and countries all around the world have found that to be true. So you've got all the defects of the income tax and none of the benefits. And because the value-added tax is extremely regressive, hits the poor and the middle class hard, largely exempts the rich. And
well, there you go. You're talking about it being, you're basically talking about it targeting the poor, but hey, at least it's just straight across the board in that sense. What are we supposed to make it scale through? Walk me through what I'm supposed to do.
Well, first of all, it's not flat like you think it is, because poor people spend all the money they make, really more than they make.
Right.
Middle income people spend about everything they make, and rich people don't. They spend a lot less than they make. So in that, and as a share of their income, the rich pay far less. Now, you ask, should anything be scaled? Well, the income tax is, and that's a good thing, because we have higher rates on the rich, the middle class and the poor pay less in taxes, and that's good.
All right, wait, but Bob, I'm not sure that's entirely good. Look, the value-added tax is a regressive tax. That's a fair statement. But I'm not really sure how we can eventually not have some additional tax. You know, Alan, to your point, we can't go any higher on an income tax. Nobody wants to pay more than 50% of their money out, their paycheck out to Uncle Sam. But we have this deficit, and it's going to have to be paid somehow, somewhere. Do I think anything's going to happen this year? No. But I can bet that you're going to have some sort of sales tax, some sort of value-added tax in place by next year. Otherwise, how are they going to continue this deficit and to pay for it?
Well, I don't know that the VAT is going to happen next year. My guess is it's probably several years or a few decades down the road, more likely decades.
I think we see something sooner than that.
But I do think that's inevitable. I have to disagree with Bob saying that the value-added tax has all the defects of the income tax, because it does not have the income tax's central defect, which is the penalty on saving. You know, part of the problem here is just the belief that we're going to be able to address our fiscal problems by imposing burdens only on 2 or 3% of the population at the top of the income distribution. And I mean, it'd be nice if that were true, but it's simply not. We're going to have to look at putting burdens more broadly down on into the middle class, either in the form of spending cuts or in the form of tax increases. I hope we see a lot of spending cuts, but I think that if we have to turn to the tax side, the value-added tax is a much better deal than the income tax.
Bob, take the last word there.
Well, just remember, when I came to Washington, the top tax rate on investment income was 70%, and we had a 10% savings rate. Now it's down to 15%, and when we have a savings rate of 0. So this idea that not taxing rich people's capital income and taxing the poor and the middle class and their spending is terrific for the economy, it's just not true.
President Obama is pursuing a big government agenda financed by massive borrowing and higher taxes. President Obama's tax plans are the subject of our face-off debate tonight. Joining me now are Professor Adam Larrick of Carnegie Mellon University, who says that under the president's plans, taxpayers will be pushed too far and that higher and higher taxes on the highest earners isn't sustainable. Arguing the other side, Robert McIntyre, Director of Citizens for Tax Justice, he says the rich aren't taxed enough and avoid paying their fair share because most of their money is the result of investment, not earnings. Gentlemen, good to have you with us here. Well, let's start, if I may. His plans are being called socialist. They're talking about class welfare. Perhaps government constrain itself and reduce its spending, particularly in a time of recession.
Well, there's no question the government should reduce its spending. The government spending now is out of control. We're now looking at trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see.
If there's no question, then why aren't we talking about how to do that, the responsible way to do that, and dealing with that issue with the urgency that presumably it deserves? The issue of constraints on government spending, which many believe should be the priority.
Well, many may believe it, but the public voted for a guy who promised them health care for everybody, which is going to be very expensive. He promised to save Social Security, which means it's going to be expensive. And you can't have those things unless you
Are you suggesting that a four-point differential in the general election on November 4th translates to a mandate of unlimited government spending? That's
not unlimited,
quite remarkable.
But specific things the public wants the government to do. And to do those things, you're going to have the tax revenues to pay for it.
But Lou, you raised the exact point. A 4-point majority is not a mandate to change our society.
See, the last guy thought it was.
Okay, well, and as I recall, Robert, you were amongst those most pleased and happy with that mandate that he had.
Oh, George Bush? Not really.
Oh, I misunderstood you then.